Hey everybody, welcome to another J.Gray Podcast number 6. I am joined by Will Roget,
Hey.
video game composer. I'm super excited to have you here, man, because the number one thing that so many of us were excited about when we were at the launch event was the soundtrack to Mortal Kombat 11 and how earnest it felt. And some of the staff from NetherRealm even said, you know, it kind of reminds me of the Lord of the Rings soundtrack with some of the variances going through it. So first of all, introduce yourself and how did you get involved with the entire Mortal Kombat 11, the whole Mortal Kombat scene from your perspective and your background?
Yeah, so I'm Will Roget. I'm a game composer. I've been doing it for an astonishingly long time. And how I got involved is kind of a complicated answer. So taking steps backward, I had just finished Call of Duty World War II. And it turned out one of our sound designers from that project had actually worked on Mortal Kombat 10. And I was kind of looking through my game collection to see like, okay, well, who would be a nice company to talk to next now that I'd finished COD and also Destiny 2 Forsaken. And I saw MKX and I was like, oh, you know, that game had amazing sound design. And I think I know someone who worked on it. So I reached out to him. And I asked, hey, can I have the audio director of NetherRealm's contact info? And he gave it to me, and I got some email. And after I emailed Rich Carl, the audio director at NetherRealm, he explained that he was already like just about to reach out to composers. And also he had attended one of my lectures at GDC a couple years back, where I talked about the Lara Croft and the Temple of Osiris score, and specifically how I did it like we didn't have the greatest budget on that game, and so how I made it sound like a huge epic score but with a reasonably small budget. And he was very interested, and so he gave me a PDF with the story of the game, talking about Raiden versus Kronika and all that. And he explained if you could just write sort of a main theme for this, something that kind of encapsulates the story and also sounds like Mortal Kombat at the same time. So I did that. I had about a week or two to put together a theme. And what I really wanted to focus on was the idea of two different sides clashing. And the way I did that was, I'm a huge fan of world music. And so I identified Raiden as having an Eastern sort of sound. So lots of Chinese and Japanese instruments, like the taiko drums and the guzheng, which is like a Chinese zither. And that was his theme. And then for Kronika, it was more of a Middle Eastern feel because she had all of this sand motif whenever she teleports in and out. And also just the sands of time. It was probably the artist's influence as well. So I had the kemenche, which is like a Middle Eastern violin, as its main instrument, as well as a bunch of different North African percussion. And so I put that all together and sent it in. And apparently they liked it. They used that as the main theme. So that's pretty much note for note what you hear when you boot up the game was my demo piece. And then later on, I just kind of, once we got the contract signed and everything, we just started from chapter 1 and went from there.
Wow. So, I mean, I would think when you're first approaching any type of project, when you have a couple of the story beats or the creative laid out in front of you, what goes through your next head for the next process? Because it seems like there's so many different options that you could dive into, so many different instruments and tones. I mean, even that breakdown you just gave helped kind of solidify or add some weight to Raiden and Kronika and the two of them going head to head. It seems like that's a great kind of journey for you to creatively find what fits for the story. Is it does it always happen that way, or is it sometimes you're kind of swimming in the dark trying to find out what's going to be the best until you finally find that sound or that those four beats that you're looking for or whatever?
Yeah, that's a great question because every game is completely different. Before this title, 2 games before, it was Call of Duty, and that one we spent an entire month on just the main theme alone, figuring out exactly what approach to use. I think I started from scratch maybe 3 times before we found something that we really wanted to go for. So sometimes it's a very difficult music direction to figure out how should this game be portrayed? How serious are we, for example? How melodic should it be versus how textural? What should the density be? Should it be big and epic, or should it be small and focused? And those were difficult questions on Call of Duty. I have to admit that on Mortal Kombat, it was actually a pretty simple answer. And partially because I'd lived with this series since I was, 12? So, I mean, these were all characters that I knew very well. The PDF didn't really have to say much. You kind of get it. You know who Raiden is. You know who Liu Kang is. Kronika was new, but otherwise, you just sort of get it. And furthermore, Mortal Kombat has such a rich musical history, from the original trilogy of games, which is what I was most familiar with, as well as the films. And so honestly, all I did was I just took that, I brought it into the year 2019 with the, modern production value, live orchestra, big choir sounds. And I also brought in some of my own sensibilities towards world instruments. I love working with instruments worldwide and vocalists as well. So I like to integrate that as much as I can in all of my scores. And once I sort of blended that all together, it basically just became the sound that we have. It didn't take too much second guessing myself, like it often happens. The way that I usually approach scoring in general, no matter how simple or complicated it is I have a lot of different brainstorming lists, usually notepad files or like Trello cards, that productivity software. And any idea I have, no matter how simple or specific or vague, I just jot it down. So maybe I'll be, lifting weights or something, and my phone music player happens upon, I don't know, some punk rock song or something. And I'll just think, well, actually, this might be interesting for this character or this part of the game or something like that. And so I'll just take a note of it. And then later on, when I'm writing that part of the game, I'll listen to those pieces that I've heard or those more abstract ideas. Like, for example, on an earlier score, colors were very big. So certain faction, it was like a two-faction, it was Star Wars. And so the Imperials seemed like they should be blues and gray and silver, whereas the Rebels were more earth tones, yellows and reds, and green. And so that was the first note that I made. And then later on, I fleshed that out to mean instrumental sounds. So with the Imperials, it meant I could use the full orchestra and snare drum ensembles, like the military feel, and very metallic sort of mallet instruments like glockenspiels to get that classic Star Wars sound. Whereas the Rebels would be more about xylophone and marimba and these more earthly tones. So I just throw all these notes out there, and that eventually derives the musical direction that I go in.
And there are other times when you put those notes out and you try it and you go, oh, this is not working.
Well, the nice thing about Trello is that the cards are ordered. So as I work through things and it maybe works better than something else, then I'll just move the card higher. And if it doesn't work at all, then, I don't have to waste too much time on it. I'm big on sketching, actually, so that I never waste time on the computer, but instead, actually, I can show you. Instead, I spend more time in the sketchbook so that...
oh, wow. So you have kind of like, how about your own table, your own way to gauge and connect the ideas to the music and vice versa?
Absolutely, yeah. Like I'm trying to find something that's... NDA safe, but it's harder than you would think.
Yeah, I'll try to cover the cameras.
Here we go, like something from MK. So I can just say, you can't really see anyway, so whatever. But yeah, it's a musical sketchbook. You shouldn't. There's staff lines.
Yeah,
Imagine.
Yeah, I can tell. So yeah, so you have the staff lines and you have the notes. So it's a sketchbook of. How long do the sketches go for? If you have a thought come through your mind, could it be like a full minute, or is it kind of a little
sometimes
transition bridge? I mean, I keep thinking of like the pop song approach to what music is in terms of my background, but a lot of my background was musical theater and singing in musical theater, and so my approach to music is kind of coming from there. But from a composer, I mean, you're working through 8, 10, 12 minute pieces to where it's going all over the place and it's having its own narrative during that theme. So do you find pockets of ideas where something's missing, or you feel like the song is complete but all of a sudden you're like, oh wait, that's one, like 4 seconds could make all the difference right here, and then you pop that in and it goes out. That's what it was missing. Kind of like a recipe, that one little piece.
Absolutely. It's very nonlinear. The reason that I sketch things on paper is because the way that I conceive music, it's like this little flash. And in that flash, I have basically the entire piece. But you have to now grab that and put it into reality in some way. Otherwise, it'll just get lost. I'll just forget everything. So I sketch very non-linearly. Maybe the first thing I write down is somewhere in the middle. And then I know, okay, later on I'll do the beginning or the end or whatever. Sometimes I'll sketch things out and then I'll realize later on, oh, actually, you need another 4 measures or 8 measures here in the middle somewhere. It's a very non-linear process, but that's why I have multiple sketchbooks so that, like this one in my pocket is for very vague ideas. But then once it gets closer to what I'll actually be writing, then I'll go into the big sketchbook, which is like an actual size thing that I only keep at home. And that's where I do most of the scoring. So when I'm doing, like, for example, a cutscene for Mortal Kombat, I'll watch it, and then I'll actually be writing down, I'll have like my stopwatch and my metronome and then the big sketchbook. And then I'll be writing down the ideas, and they should hypothetically line up with real time so that I can say, hey, okay, I'm here at measure 17 or whatever. This should be at SMPTE code 2 minutes and 30-something seconds, and it's when Raiden does a thing or whatever. And then I have my music to go along with that. And once that's all finished and fleshed out, and I do spend a good amount of time just on paper before I put anything in the computer, I'll take one last playthrough where I'm watching the video in real time and then reading along and making sure everything aligns properly. And once that's finished, then I go into the computer and actually produce the music and make whatever adjustments I need to make that work.
It's kind of like a carpenter, you measure twice and then you cut once.
Absolutely.
Because even in the creative process, if you have an idea and you hold on to it too tightly and you don't try to polish it or see if you can come up with something better, it's not going to be your best work. And that's really tough because sometimes, you think it is your best work and you want to jump right on top of it, but then you flesh it out. And this is what I've learned through writing over the last couple of years. It's like, oh, this is like the best way to write this paragraph. Then you go to sleep and you wake up the next day. Nope, I know I could edit this. I could change this word. And that, I feel that there is an extreme on that level too, when you're trying to over perfect it or you're trying to make it even better than what it should be sometimes. Sometimes the flaws are what give it that character. It's just a very, very intriguing approach from my perspective too when it comes to video game soundtracks. Because some of my favorite soundtracks were Final Fantasy and the composer Nobuo Uematsu, who wrote so many compelling themes and songs that I would resonate with the same that I resonated with Star Wars and Leia's theme and Luke's theme and the Imperial March, and how many people I've met that have loved the music, and why you see a touring orchestra going around the world and playing. I mean, they were just playing in Australia, and one of the Skill Up Layman Gaming guys that I watch on YouTube was advertising as part of their ad block. So it's really, really fascinating to see the limitations that Nobuo Uematsu had with MIDI devices and pre-Nintendo 64 graphics.
Yeah.
So from your perspective in the history of video game composing, how much has that factored into why you wanted to get involved in the business? Have you looked back at the history and seen how much stuff has changed and how much you have at your fingertips, instrumental-wise, tools-wise? And overall, kind of what inspired you to want to follow this career path and to have some great successes, some serious AAA games come out of your repertoire over the last 5 years?
Yeah. Well, first off, thank you very much. I feel incredibly grateful that I've been able to work on these projects. But in 3 words, Final Fantasy VII. I was a musician my whole life, mostly a pianist, and I'd always been big on improvisation. Like sometimes I would go home and not feel like actually practicing the music. So I would literally just make up something that used similar techniques to what I was supposed to be studying. And then I would just play that. And eventually that kind of grew into my writing original music. And I wasn't really serious about it until I played Final Fantasy VII. And that was my first console game that I really really felt passionate about. Previously, maybe I would go to the arcades and play Mortal Kombat, but otherwise, I never really got into the whole console gaming thing until FF7. And I saw it on television, some ad for it, and it was advertised like a movie. Like, you remember, it would say things like, "We have a cast of thousands," and it just seemed like this awesome, amazing thing. So I played it, and it felt like the score was so friendly and inviting. There's something about it that said, "Hey, listen to this gorgeous music. You can do it too." And from then, I started doing a lot of transcriptions. That's in fact how I learned how to write music. Was I would listen to, like, this is long before we had MP3s. So if you wanted to listen to music from your favorite game, you had to listen to the MIDI file that some nerd in the basement had, spent all week transcribing note for note. And I was one of those nerds, just like taking all this time to make sure every single note and articulation and whatnot was exactly or as close to the original as I could. But that's really what inspired me. That's and a couple of other, especially Squaresoft RPGs like Vagrant Story and Final Fantasy Tactics.
Super Mario RPG Legend of the Seven Stars.
That was your favorite?
Yeah, it was one of my favorite Squaresoft games ever.
Nice.
Ever. Yeah. And that took the Mario cast along with a couple new characters they introduced and put in RPG elements. And that's probably the game that myself and my sister Amanda played the most on the Super Nintendo. Like nice. Like almost every summer, one of us would play through that game.
Awesome.
But yeah, and that music was great. There was a certain theme around one of these new characters that they introduced, and I remember this moment where he makes his entrance on this little train. He's kind of like one of the bad guys because Bowser's castle got taken over by an alien sword, from what I remember from the story. And he says his lines, and it's goofy and it's funny, and then he makes this face, and his theme song kicks in right when he's leaving on the train again. And I go, the power of music in these video games. So that one sticks with me a lot, and that's Squaresoft. So Squaresoft, absolutely influential around the world when it came to those games. And for people that have no idea what Final Fantasy VII was to all of us is, this is the PlayStation, the original PlayStation. 4 discs, I believe, was the whole game. Maybe 3. Yeah, 3 discs, where you would play the whole game or everything on that disc, and then you switch out to the next disc for the next chapter, or the next, you could say is broken up into 3 acts.
Yeah.
The next act. But at least 10 to 15 plus hours of story, single player per disc.
Easily like 30 or 40 in your first playthrough, especially.
Oh, yeah.
And I was an idiot because I never played an RPG before, so I'm just floundering around, wondering why I'm dying every 5 minutes and stuff.
And it was the first game that I ever played that outside of Resident Evil. No, I had never played Resident Evil yet, so this was the first one. Resident Evil 2 was on Nintendo 64. I remember that. The experience of walking into a room where the room's different. As Cloud, okay, now you have to walk in this diagonal pattern to get over to the other side of the city. The world was different every little place that you loaded, or the path was different. I remember how crazy I thought that was because I was so used to 2D platformers, and you're kind of either going left or right, or right. Or up and down. But now you were in this fully fleshed out polygon 3D world. And I just remembered how new that felt because I had borrowed a friend of mine's PlayStation. But that was still, when it came to music, I think that was still MIDI, right? They hadn't gone full orchestra yet. But some of those songs have been rescored for full orchestras now for the remake and all the concerts and stuff. But what an influential game, man. That's influenced so many different people.
Absolutely. And about the tech in FF7, the way it worked actually was it was just an expansion of the Super Nintendo. So on the Super Nintendo, they had 8 channels, and it was sample-based. So it was basically MIDI. Like, you could have audio files being triggered as individual notes, and it was sampling that in real time. On the PlayStation 1, I believe it was expanded to 24. So Uematsu-san's concept for FF7 was, let me have a similar musical style to 6. But now I have way more sample data that I can work with. So he did things like having music in every conceivable genre. You have like the fiddly chocobo themes, and of course you have Sephiroth's theme with the live choir and everything, which was, again, all triggered through this MIDI system. So he just kind of sampled individual phrases of the choir and then play those back as if it were a single note. So he employed a lot of very clever techniques with it. I think that Yasunori Mitsuda also had a very interesting way of working with MIDI at the time. From his Chrono Trigger score on Super Nintendo, he was doing really interesting stuff with how he was loading the samples in such a way that it sounded like a generation beyond what it should have been. It sounded that much better than pretty much everything else because of the way that he was able to squeeze out just that much more memory out of the machine. And then, of course, on PlayStation 1, he took it a step further with Xenogears and then later Chrono Cross, where he had full, live orchestral work as well as live choir and whatnot. Xenogears begins with this beautiful intro theme that uses this Bulgarian Slavic choir, along with the fully produced MIDI instruments that were created outside of the game, not in real time. And then at the ending of the game, it has this incredible Slavic choir performance as the ending theme, which was one of the most beautiful things I'd ever heard in my entire life at the time. And then later on in Chrono Cross, once again, Mitsuda-san had beautiful music throughout the whole game, again, really pushing the envelope of what you can do with this real-time MIDI. Lots of incredibly realistic guitar. And then in the ending, it was an actual guitar and vocal performance.
It's almost close to the Top Gun theme. Chrono Cross is my favorite video game soundtrack of all time.
Yeah.
In particular, the opening movie when you first load the game or just let it sit is so good. That
Absolutely,
whole opening score. But when you go into the alternate reality, and it's the world map for the first time, and it has this one violin playing. I've listened to that song more than any other song from any other video game in my entire life.
That song made me want to learn the violin.
Yes!
So I
have one now.
Yeah. I borrowed a violin from a classmate. This is like, let's say, 11th grade, junior year of high school. And I borrowed a violin specifically because I loved that track. I think it's called Dreams of a Shore Bordering Another World.
Yes, there's something like that.
Yeah, I sounded awful. I mean, it just, you can't imagine how terrible. And you got to imagine some kid in the basement every day, they're
man.
just, butchering it.
Sorry, neighbors.
But,
sorry, parents.
Well, yeah, more like sorry, parents, family, extended family.
Dang.
But it was, still, it was such an incredible score that I to this day, I still love. I believe that there's a new arrangement album that he's just done.
Really?
For Chrono Cross. Yeah, he did one for Xenogears last year with a really well-produced live orchestra and choir. I'm not sure if the CD is out, but it was like a one-time only performance in Japan.
Okay.
Which I believe they recorded because the sound quality is way too high for it to just be like, all right, we're done here.
Wow. Okay.
And I think Chrono Cross is next.
That's amazing. I really hope that I can find that somewhere. I have also loved the other albums that Square Enix now has done. They did a Celtic Moon version of Final Fantasy IV. Oh. They took a lot of those themes but did those type of instruments and performances with it. And it's really, really good. I really enjoyed that one too. So now that we've seen kind of, the regular Nintendo, the first Nintendo, Super Nintendo, Nintendo 64, you talked about the devices and the technology. What about today? Are there really any limitations when it comes to composing for video games? Because we just had Gears 5 with Ramin Djawadi, who did all of Game of Thrones and also scores Westworld.
Yeah.
So to have, that measure of talent, you are in that same mix as somebody who has worked on such huge scores for television. So do you feel when you come to the table that you have the same instruments or space that a major film production would have compared to, let's say, 15, 20 years ago in the video game space? Because it seems that way now, that more and more composers are being involved in the video game world that come from the film world.
Yeah, right now there's not, in terms of production, there's really no difference between a game score and a television and film. It really all comes down to budget. And then some game scores have astronomical budgets, like high six figures and whatnot, recording with the London Symphony Orchestra, Abbey Road, That's what we did for some of the Star Wars games that I worked on. Star Wars First Assault, which unfortunately was never released, but we recorded that with the London Symphony Orchestra at Abbey Road Studios and mixed by John Kurlander, who is actually the mix engineer from all the Lord of the Rings films. And also the Beatles' Abbey Road. He worked on that, so he's been around for quite some time doing amazing stuff. But it always comes down to the budget. I mean, there's some film scores where they don't have a single note of live music, and you never know because they're just so good at doing the sampled mock-up orchestra. But it just all comes down to the timing and budget and whatnot. Back in the day, of course, we did have technical limitations, but speaking as someone who, believe it or not, has been writing game music since maybe 1999, it didn't feel like a limitation back then. The moment where you could use your own samples, you weren't restricted to what General MIDI could give you, but instead you could say, hey, I like this sound of a flute doing whatever. I'm just going to use that. That's the exact moment where pretty much the limitations were lifted, because you could do anything. Like, maybe you only have 8 voices or 24 or whatever, but there's nothing stopping you from having one of those 8 voices be like an entire orchestra playing a hit or something. Or maybe like instead of a single note, it's an octave now. Nothing stopped you from doing that. Maybe the cartridge size certainly meant that you had to reduce your sample quality and whatnot. But the moment that you could have your own samples, I think that's when we stopped thinking in terms of limitations and more about, well, what can I bring to the table? For example, on Chrono Cross specifically, and I suspect that Mitsuda-san does this, or at least back in the day did this for every soundtrack. He identified one style of music. I think it's called the Fado guitar style. It's popular, I think, in Portugal or Spain. And he basically said, well, how do I replicate this as faithfully as I can? I think he sampled some of his own guitar playing in order to make it sound quite natural. But instead of just sampling the individual notes, he also sampled the sound it makes when you slide your fingers across the guitar.
Oh, okay.
So it sounds incredibly realistic. And that was a part of the technical artistry, if you want to call it that. Fast forward 20 years, and nowadays, especially when you're doing these mock-up orchestras that aren't necessarily the live group, you still have little things you can do like that are more of a technical nature. And then even if you are using a live orchestra, most composers nowadays don't just restrict themselves to the orchestra, but they also incorporate synthesis or sort of musical sound design into the mix. Like with Call of Duty, for instance, I used a lot of musical sound design, a technique that's called musique concrète, where we take sounds from the world and incorporate that into the music. So I would do things like take authentic World War II vehicles and weapon sounds, and I would process them in various ways and use that as the percussion section of the orchestra, as opposed to using the typical cymbals and snare drums. And I could make it fit a lot better, and it gave this sort of authentic World War II Haze of War vibe that became a signature sound of the score. So there's always been this sort of balance between the creative and the technical. I don't think that's really changed at all.
Okay. Sometimes I get concerned that there's too many options, out there as an artist, where you're like, oh, I can do anything. Okay, well, what's the first step? Mm-hmm. I just finished Gears 5 recently, and I enjoyed the soundtrack. There was a number of themes and moments that was pretty good. Another game that I played over the summer, because I'm kind of trying to take a break from games for a bit to work on the house and work on other stuff, was Final Fantasy XIV. And how much I enjoyed some of the themes and some of the tracks there, but also kind of the bygone era of RPGs back in the day when you didn't have voice acting. You didn't have the voiceover. It was just the written word, as well translated as it could have been, and the music. And I wonder if, because of that, there was so much more reliance or weight put on the music because you didn't have the voice performances. And then once now video games are pretty much AAA blockbuster events, at least for the AAA ones, in terms of a film production, where you have the voice and you have the performance, and sometimes the music is just generic. You know, that's one of the complaints I would say for a lot of people when it comes to the Marvel films, is you don't have a lot of themes that stand out. It's a lot of just generic action type music. Have you noticed anything like that in the terms of, you know, how influential Final Fantasy was, and then really like the latest Final Fantasies haven't had those kind of sweeping things that we remembered, or is it just style and different composers bring something different to the table that resonates with different people? I personally feel it's kind of a mix of both.
Yeah. So the way you phrased it as music had more weight back then, I think it's more that music had less competition back then, and in several different dimensions. So first off, not only was there no voiceover, and voiceover is usually the biggest competition. Like if you're out playing the voiceover and nobody can understand what's going on, then people will just mute the music. But also sound design. There was much less environmental sound design back then. And even the action sounds were much simpler. You didn't really have to worry about extreme. I mean, if you look at Kratos swinging his axe, you realize that's like 100 sounds that a friend of mine, Chris Clannon's brilliant, one of the most brilliant sound designers in like history. He's put together these elaborate, it feels like an orchestration of sound just for one axe swing. Whereas if it were Super Nintendo, it would just, and that's it. You know? So music has a lot more competition now. And also, due to the way that we consume games, the music is required nowadays pretty much to not have a very simple, like, hey, intro looping section and just go again and again, 100 times. We don't really have that luxury anymore. Instead, we have to compose and fit into these very elaborate interactive systems, which try their best not to bombard you with the same theme over and over and over and over. So it's not that the music is necessarily generic, but it's more that it has to fit into the soundscape, and that's been sort of the goal nowadays. So the challenge, it's actually much more challenging to have an outstanding melody that anyone remembers, because not only do you have to fight against this interactive system, which is trying its best to not be to not get annoying after a while. It has to be unobtrusive, and it has to enhance gameplay rather than being the star of the show. But also you have to battle against the sound design and the voiceover, and the fact that these are action games in 3 dimensions where you have so much more going on than you did back in the day. So the player's attention is much less, and they can't really focus on too many things at once. So it's much more difficult, I think, nowadays to have a really strong melodic component actually be heard. You can definitely do it, but you have to be extremely conservative about, for example, how many melodies that you're using. Because nowadays, no matter how good the melody is, I mean, you could almost take one of those classic soundtracks from like Super Nintendo or whatever and bring it into a modern game. And, any piece that you thought, oh, this is so brilliant, I'll never forget this melody, it was so great, and you will never pick it up. You'd never even notice it in a modern game because it's just not possible to have the player's attention for long enough for that to develop. Meanwhile, back in the day, not only did you have nothing competing with it, but you also heard it 100 times within, an hour. And also, the other thing about classic game music is that a lot of the composers came from the rock music world. So the music was organized usually in a very predictable form. You would have the intro and then sort of like a verse and a chorus, and it would just go verse, chorus, verse, chorus, verse, chorus. And as such, the melodies were actually rather predictable. You knew exactly when to perk up and like pay attention. It's like, oh, I know something's coming now. Just like you would for a rock song on the radio, you're waiting for the chorus and that sort of classic tension and release vibe. Whereas for modern scores, because of the way that it's trying to be that cinematic sort of not too obviously repetitive vibe, you don't exactly know when to expect which melody. And it also usually has to be rather motivic rather than thematic. So it's not necessarily something that you can, go down the street humming. But instead, it's more of a functional, like, we need a calling card for this concept or this character or whatever. This sort of leitmotif idea.
Yeah.
Similar to Lord of the Rings, actually,
Yep.
where it's more about having a much more unique sound for individual ideas or concepts or characters, rather than the more generic concept of like, well, here's the rock song and here's the verse and the chorus, and we're just going to keep going back and forth between those.
Yeah, I think leitmotif is a perfect description, because even playing Gears, when you would discover something or somebody died and you were remembering them, you'd hear that bum 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 bum, so like that you have come to know from Gears 1, that little leitmotif. But then when you mentioned Lord of the Rings, just the Fellowship of the Ring theme every time in the first movie, bum 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 bum, even when they're scaling the mountain, and it's what, a 10-second little motif, but every time that happens, you know this is the Fellowship theme. And I feel that there hasn't been that strong of an influence, or at least a connection, in a lot of games recently. You brought up a lot of great points. I think ultimately it comes down to just the creative vision of the game director, and also really finding moments for the music to swell and to stand out. And one of the games that has done that in one of the most impactful and beautiful ways was The Witcher 3. Did you encounter that scene when you go to the inn and Priscilla?
Oh,
man. So Priscilla, who's this character in The Witcher 3, you're at this tavern, kind of like the poor area of the town, and she just strums a lute and sings this song.
Yeah.
And everybody stops, and you see people start to get cozy, and the candles starting to burn a little bit brighter, and it makes you just be in this world and understand the lyrics of the song and what it means, and where Geralt, the main character, is right now in the adventure. It is one of the most profound ways music's been used in video games to date, and that song is performed in many different languages, because CD Projekt Red is all about localization. That's how they got their start as a company. And you can hear that song be performed in multiple different languages, and even, I believe, CD Projekt Red made a compilation video of all the languages that are singing that song. Oh, wow. But it's a beautiful, beautiful ballad. And I hope that we have more of those moments, and not just limit it to RPGs, where you can have these moments to let the composer kind of shine through and play that melody or that theme that really punches through to the audience. But again, it's that type of narrative and storytelling, right? It's a little bit difficult to do that in the midst of a giant, firefight to have those moments. The other motif that comes to mind is Battlefield. That ba-bum-bum. Like, whenever you hear that motif, like, okay, somebody's in a tank and they're crashing through some buildings and they're having some fun. So yeah, music is, it's just so incredibly powerful how much that resonates with so many of us that go back in the gaming days, that go back before the big voiceovers. The first voiceover of Final Fantasy was Final Fantasy X, and I remember how that really started to solidify what Lost in Translation means for some of the lines that are in that game. But what a great story! One of my favorite stories when it came to Final Fantasy. Man, can you believe that game now, I think, is like 20 years old? It's getting close to it.
It's pretty crazy.
Ooh. Next generation, though, we got that next Final Fantasy VII remake coming out, and you are at the Tokyo Game Show. I'm going to ask about that, but first we have a question from chat from Euphemism. Are you more likely to build a song by melody than adding the instruments that make it, or do you have particular instruments in mind and generate the melody around them? You had talked about the different instruments, the earthier tones versus the metallic tones. Does that happen every time, or is it a different process depending on either budget or how you approach it?
Yeah, that's a great question. It kind of depends. I mean, I can't say too much about it, but one of my current projects, I've kind of decided that one specific, very unusual instrument is going to be the heart of it. I mean, it's sort of big, action-y normally, but then I want to make sure that there's something to round it out and make it feel like a full human experience. And so I have this instrument, and then I kind of have been writing these melodies that I know will work on it. Other times, I'll have a melodic thing in mind, and then I'll have to think later on about like, well, what was that? What was it that I heard in my mind when I was conceiving of this melody? And then I kind of go from there. I think I've been more successful when it's been starting with the color first, and then figuring out where the melody goes from there. Like for me, melody is a very it's rather technical. The way that I build themes is a very technical process where first I'm, there's the initial idea, and this is the spark that made me think like, oh, well, maybe this is worth spending some time on. And then just hours and hours of singing through it, singing in the shower, singing as I'm walking back and forth in my apartment, and it's almost like a CPU, like just moving things around. Like maybe I'll move this over 1/8 note or something, or let me try this. Or what if the pitch goes down instead of up? Or like, do I even need this section? Can I repeat? All these different possibilities that I'm cycling through until eventually it's something that I can remember. That's something that really sticks with you. Sleep is another big part of the process, believe it or not.
Yeah, you have to let it process. You have to give it a day or two.
I mean, like, I'll write stuff down, whatever, and then I'll wake up, and then it's like, all right, well, how do I remember it? It might not necessarily be how I wrote it initially, and very often I'll have these like just this weird stubbornness where I'm like, no, it should be like this, but my mind keeps playing it back the other way, and then once I've taken a nap or whatever and come back to it, it's like, this is the way I keep remembering it. Maybe I should just write it that way. So again, it's a very technical process, whereas with texture and harmony, it's more about, it's a lot more fluent. It's not necessarily strict in terms of the technique. It's more whatever I just felt like. Sometimes I'll click the wrong note or something, and then I'll be like, that sounds good. Let's keep,
and kind of see where things fall after you just go through it for a while.
Exactly.
Cool.
Yeah.
Cool. That can be even, again, improvisation, right? You talked about music improvisation. That's what you're doing with your sketchbook. Makes a lot of sense. We'll take another question from chat. From Danish Saeed, what was the primary emotion you wanted to invoke with your MK11 main theme?
Yeah. Well, first off, hey, Danish. He's also from the MK team.
Oh, right on, man.
Yeah. The emotion I wanted to evoke. To me, the MK11, when I read, even when I read the PDF, but especially once I read through the script, it felt like, man, they can't do another game after this. This is so huge. So I wanted to, do two things. One, I wanted to harken back to the classic MK sound and what I remembered of it. Especially Mortal Kombat 2. I think Dan Forden's work on MK2 and 3 were really my favorites growing up. 3 was a little bit more urban and more electronic, so I didn't think that quite fit with this game. But 2 especially was, it just seemed like that should be the blueprint. So I listened to that again, and I was like, okay, there's certain elements here from both a technical and also an emotional vibe that definitely work. If I had one word answer to that question, the answer would be violence, but but more specifically, it was the main theme, especially the guzheng part, the sort of motif like bum 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 da da dum. If you think about it, it's sort of like a war horn call.
Yes,
it's never really played that way until like the very, very end when spoilers, but when Liu Kang defeats Kronika at the very beginning of that cutscene, it's never really played that way. But when it's on these smaller instruments, these like kotos and guzheng and these Asian instruments, East Asian instruments, it's almost like solidifying that violence is just a part of this world. It's how they solve their problems. And that's how I wanted the theme to go. I wanted it to be like, this is totally normal for this extremely violent thing to just be a part of their culture.
Now, I think this is where it was resonating when I was talking to Rigo and a couple people at the reveal. It's that guttural, deep, orc type horn from Lord of the Rings, but that when you that motif, that ba-da-dun, ba-da-dun, ba-da-da-dun, dun, dun, and like when you hear that, it's invoking war. It's invoking, okay, we're getting the masses together, we're going Tarkatan, if you will. Like I would think of the Tarkatans when I would hear that inspirational, type of push musically, and that's like we kept hearing that theme over and over again, obviously during rehearsal, but that is exactly right. Like the way that you use that instrumentation to, one, fits totally in Mortal Kombat, but two, harkens to that it's time to fight. Yeah. That's really cool, man, because that harkens into the psychology of humans and how we've used instruments in the past and what those instruments mean, why we use them, why we use a snare drum to stay on pace during our marches, why you had the little drummer boy back in the day, or why you use the horn. Just the incredible approach from Mortal Kombat to me is the diversity of all the different realms that have been conquered for how many tens of thousands of years by Shao Kahn, where Outworld is just this mix of all of these different people and races and beings. But the one thing that does connect them is violence, is the Khan, is the one that leads them, right? So I really enjoy that, and I really hope, fingers crossed, no idea what's going to happen in the future with the game, but to kind of expand a bit more on how does this Outworld function, which we got a bit of that in MKX and MK11 now with Katana Khan taking over, which I'm super stoked on. But you just saw the conflict between the Aditians and the Tarkatans, and now with Collector, I forget his race, but and then all of these different ones, and I see there's a lot of rich potential, even to know what their backgrounds are, or what musical instruments they would use on their planet and stuff like that.
One of my favorite things about MKX was that one stage where it was like the Outworld marketplace or whatever with the old lady who's shambling around and you can throw her
Blanche,
Blanche, because that. I don't think we'd ever seen that before, like a functional Outworld society. When you watch the movies, or the original movie, it was like, okay, now we're in Outworld, Johnny Cage and Liu Kang, and it was just this dark thing.
Everything's made of like lightning and purple.
Yeah, and it's all, and it seems like nothing could function here. It looks like, the worst part of town that you never go to.
Yeah, why would anybody rule that?
Yeah, it just seemed so dysfunctional. But then now we see daytime in Outworld, and it is functional. People have commerce and markets, and it's incredibly diverse. And of course, they have the Colosseum, and they have their method of entertainment, but it sort of fleshed it out as being a real place that made sense in context. And I really enjoyed that about MK10 especially.
Yeah, it expanded that world, which is where it should have gone. And I'm glad that it did. And I'm glad we have the roster of characters that we do now, which is pretty cool. And I'm looking forward to more of the DLC, which has been announced. Just overall with the game production, and I see that Danish is asking if you could get a score of the movie, which I'm sure would be awesome. But
I considered asking my agent about that, but then I realized like I'm already way too busy right now, and I would have to probably move to LA and all that kind of thing, and probably they'll go with someone quite experienced. And
George S. Clinton, man, maybe he'll make a comeback.
I would hope so. Oh my goodness, I would hope so.
You cannot deny that part of the major success of the first Mortal Kombat film was because of the soundtrack.
Oh, absolutely. Not just, obviously you have the Immortals theme, which everyone knows.
Sure.
But if you listen to the underscore, I don't know how he did it, because the film schedules are usually quite tight, but it just seemed like he perfectly encapsulated what they were doing with the games, but of course with the Hollywood film budget and production and whatnot.
And a 90s flair too. That's what's so unique about that specific song, but even like the reptile theme during that fight scene and other themes, is that it's a product of its time, sure, but when they released the final trailer for MK11 and it used a remix version of that song, that was the cherry on top of everything, because that song is just ubiquitous with Mortal Kombat and will be to the end of time. Which again, kudos to you, because your theme for MK11 now is going to resonate with the theme for Mortal Kombat when it comes to the video game world.
Hopefully, yeah.
It does. I know Pig of the Hut has been super critical about the previous video game music, and he's a big fan of the soundtrack. And so if you can please him, Brant McCaskill, then you're definitely on the right track. So, I mean, just good for you, man. I could just imagine the amount of pressure that you would have been under to score, a game like this, because you're a fan. I mean, you and I are super fans of this franchise. So can you kind of tell me just emotionally what that was like to work on the specific, project, and then when it was all done, and then you saw people's reactions? What was kind of the, I can't believe I'm now going to be a part of this. Now I am a part of it, and my work has been very influential and very substantial.
It's very schizophrenic. I don't know exactly how it works mentally, but the same thing happened with Call of Duty, where it was just like you have to kind of block out of your mind the fact that millions of people are going to listen to this. I would almost say that, and I don't know if this is because I did it before or because it's like $1 billion franchise. Well, I guess they're both, but like, with COD, it was, every night I would go to bed and be like, just terrified, just thinking like, is this going to ruin my career? I'm going to get fired. Like what's going on?
That's how I feel right before I go on camera. Like, well, it's been a fun ride.
This might be it.
This may be it. All right, Ed, let's go.
Yeah,
Dang, that's a very real feeling. And
no, it is. But when you're doing the work, it's not about. And this feels so weird to think about it this way, because obviously, I care so much about the way that the fans receive it. I'm a member of a lot of game music fan communities, and it's so important to me. But at the same time, it's like once you've gotten started, the only thing that matters is just like growing this seed into a healthy tree of music. You just have this concept and you have to develop it, and it just follows its own rules. It's its own separate thing that's completely abstract. And the realities of the world can kind of influence it a little bit, but it sort of doesn't. I leave that to my audio directors, and I've worked with unbelievably great audio directors who've pushed me always in the right direction. But from my perspective, my only job is to just take that initial seed and grow it into something, and have it make sense by its own parameters. So when it comes to the fan reactions, it almost, and I say this truthfully, it almost feels like someone else wrote the music, and then I'm just very distanced from it, because it's not. It doesn't feel like while I was writing it, like I was writing for this, mega franchise top-selling game of the year thing. It just felt like, all right, well, I have to make sure that I get from this key to this key in a reasonable way. You know what I mean? Like it was all about the work. It didn't, the extra musical factors didn't really matter that much. Now that said, every single meeting I had with Rich, and Marty was our cinematics director, over the phone, I had to apologize for the fanboyism. I because they would show me things like Katana Khan, and I would just be like so amped up when I saw that for the first time. It was just ridiculous. But then, once I'm getting into my sketchbook and analyzing it, it didn't seem like this super crazy, larger than life important thing that would stand up to video game history. It just felt like, okay, this is what I have to do here and there. So yeah, like I said, it's sort of a schizophrenic, like you just distance yourself from that and you just kind of go for it.
It can be very weird too, because I look back at my personal relationship with Mortal Kombat and how influential that was to me as a kid, and the video games and the movies, and how excited I was. Now, being involved with them for a certain amount of years, I just can't even believe it sometimes. But then when I look at it, I go, well, it's the work. They hire me to host or to produce this, or I produce this show. And what I sat down, wrote out what we'd be doing every time block, how we would try to tell the best narrative. It was just everything that I had learned in the past and trying to apply it to something I was super passionate about.
Yeah.
But yeah, some days I look back and go, oh my God, January I hosted the reveal event for MK11. I got to do all these things. And people on the outside are like, oh, it's amazing. Oh my God. Your life is so crazy. It's cool. Like, I'm glad you think that way.
Yeah.
But
in your case, it's much harder because not only do you have to go on camera, nothing I do is live. Well, except this. But.
Yeah, this is live.
but yeah, you had to go on camera. And also, if I was at that reveal event actually, and you had to sit there and see the audience going crazy, which I imagine kind of made it seem so real that, this is in fact this incredible franchise that you've had to you've had the opportunity to lead, for this event.
Yeah, I guess the kind of the best way to describe it is you kind of want something as a kid your entire life, and then you finally get it. And then you look around and go, okay, what's next? Or don't squander the opportunity. Don't rest on your laurels. You gotta not rest on your latest successes. You got to keep going. But at the same time, use that as a wellspring of personal inspiration, or be like, hey, if NetherRealm trusted in me enough to be the face and voice for the esports side for this tournament, then I should have enough courage to go talk to that girl at the bar. Which sounds stupid, but at the same time, that's how our brains work.
Yeah.
And to kind of give that boost of self-confidence, but also to walk into a room and be like, yeah, I've been on television to work on video game related events, and I've been doing it for the last 10 years.
And you just go too far with it. It's
yeah,
like, they
exactly.
say you shouldn't stick forks in electrical sockets. But I did do Mortal Kombat, so...
Yeah, and that's where the hubris destroys you. This is, I guess, on being on the other side of things now in my 30s, this is what it feels like to be a working artist, is that you have your peak, your amazing peak of that was going to be an influential and incredible experience, and I had a good payday and that was awesome. Then you have your valleys where you really don't have anything coming down the pipeline, or you don't know what your next step's going to be. And that duality, even in the same year, can be very, very stressful, and sometimes lead to that self-doubt where, I just had an incredible 6 months at the beginning of this year, but this last couple months have been just kind of slow going when it comes to projects. So for you as an artist working in the music field, have you encountered that throughout your career? And if so, what have you done to kind of overcome it? Or do you always have kind of that backup plan in your back pocket just in case things dry up?
Yeah, that's a great question, especially for if there's any, I tweeted this out and such, so if there's any other like freelance composers, I think this is good advice to follow. You will have ups and downs and whatnot. Right now, I feel incredibly lucky. I've had a lot of great projects in the last several years, and then some great ones that I'm working on now. I think this year alone, maybe 4 or 5 different games and VR experiences that I'm working on. Unfortunately, simultaneously. So that's not that much is not great.
That's how it happens.
But you always have to. I used to be friends with this fantastic and very well-known agent for video game music. He's retired now, but his advice to me was the most important word in this industry is next. What happens next? And even while you're still working and you're either having fun or you're drowning in the work or whatever, you still kind of have to start thinking about, well, once this is over, now what? What am I going to do to promote this score that I just finished? And what am I going to do to get the next score and the next one and the next one? And that's something that I thought of all the way through my time while I was at LucasArts. I used to be at LucasArts in-house for a number of years, mostly working on Star Wars games and also some Monkey Island stuff and whatnot. And while I was there, I tried my best to go to the GDC, the Game Developers Conference, and make as many friends as I could in the industry while I was employed and didn't really need to make friends, if you know what I mean. Well, I always need to make friends, but you know what I mean. Didn't need like work now. Yeah. And that's definitely helped me, especially in those very first projects. I got Lara Croft from a friend I'd made maybe 2 years before, Alex Wilmer, who was our audio director. And we'd connected because we were both working on music implementation, which is sort of like the technical side of how music plays back in the games. And we'd shared ideas. And when it came time that he needed a composer for Lara Croft, it was much easier for us to connect because we'd already talked about that. And that's what he needed for the game, someone to both compose and implement. So inevitably there were valleys, especially once LucasArts ended. It ended quite abruptly.
Oh, yeah.
And
it ended quite abruptly for everybody.
It did, yeah.
We'll dive into that in a little bit. Yeah. But
but that's, once that happened, I knew right away that out of everyone in the studio, all 200-something odd people, I knew that I would be the very last person, the very absolute last person to become gainfully employed. I knew that from the start, and I was correct. I hope. But I also knew that I had made enough connections in the industry that I should be okay. I'd saved up a lot of money. I had a very cheap apartment while I was in San Francisco. And eventually Dead Island happened and Lara Croft happened. And then there were some lulls after Dead Island was canceled as well. But still, I think that the most important thing while you're in those lulls is to find something to do. Like you have to do your own projects and keep yourself occupied. I think that's when I was working on the tech aspects of my job the most, when upgrading PC and setting up orchestral templates and really diving deep into that world and making sure that I could have the highest quality possible. And then I also did, I think, 2 different albums, solo albums, neither of which should anyone listen to, but they were great for developing skills in different fields. And then they both kind of led into great things. And eventually Call of Duty happened and some more work for Star Wars The Old Republic as well. So it never really felt like I was in a complete desolate lull. And I'm incredibly grateful for that as well.
Good to hear. It can be tough for any type of artists out there. Just got to save that money. That's the biggest piece of advice I'd give to anybody. And T-Pain taught a friend this, and that friend taught me this. So vicariously, I learned it through T-Pain. Save half of every paycheck.
Yeah.
And just try to cultivate that type of lifestyle. Half of every paycheck just goes to your savings account, and you live off the other half. If it's bills, expenses, rent, etc. And I've been trying to cultivate that over the last number of months. It works. Yeah. Super happy to always act like I'm broke. It's a good way to save money.
And impressive. I mean, you have a really nice setup here. I can see it growing into a really cool sort of studio.
Step by step, man. But thank you. Yeah, I definitely, that side I want to put in a couch and do more of my J.Gray reports on that side, just kind of quick updates type things. I really was going to go gung-ho with a lot of content on YouTube over the summer, but then I had a gig with Microsoft. And I did a 3-month gig with them for their Mixer Matchup show that went very, very well. We had the finals at E3. We were giving out $500 to the top 50 players every week for 3 weeks, man. I mean, can you imagine signing up for a tournament, and if you make just at least top 50, you're getting $500? I mean, I would have loved to have done that every week, but the budget was limited. So I got to do that.
And this is on Gears of War,
or we did 3 different games. We did League of Legends, Halo, and Paladins.
Okay.
And we did 1 game per week, and then people would stream, and we would tally up their points based off how many kills or wins they would get. So it was more of a digital arcade rather than just a bracket system.
Nice.
And we had a really fun finals event. It just went really, really well. So I was doing that full time April through June on top of bartending at 2 different spots, or hosting at one spot and bartending at another. And I was wiped out, man. 3 jobs at once was too much for me, but we kicked butt, made it through the show, and then after the show ended in June, Microsoft was going to let us know if they're going to do another season. Not sure yet if they will before the end of the year. There is a possibility. So I have possibly that in the future. If not, that's cool too, because I've been busting my butt bartending and getting way better at being a bartender. And having that as just a baseline right now that helps fund this and get this gear, and then we'll help fund Battle for Seattle. It's a really empowering feeling. Yeah. And I love the story that you told. The agent said the most powerful word in the industry is next. Another word that's very, very powerful that I like to say is no. That if I have a project come my way, or if it's something that just doesn't really resonate with me, or they're not paying me anything, stuff like that. Like, I'm sorry. I'm at that stage of my career and that stage of my life where I can say no, and it's going to be fine, because
it's not easy.
No, it's not. It's not easy. But having one, that backup, and 2, this home base, if you will, to make my own stuff creatively, keeps that fire alive, keeps that desire and passion to be an entertainer alive outside of just waiting for the next gig. And it's so incredible we're able to do that now. Like in the 1970s, if you were an out-of-work actor, you were probably a carpenter, like Harrison Ford was, till he landed Star Wars or American Graffiti. So we have all these amazing creative outlets in order to put our stuff out there. But for you in music, do you have any desire career-wise to do stuff on your own? Or are you just happy to be part of the bigger team of putting together the composing of the video game score?
Yeah, people ask me that very often of like, oh, do you ever write your own music? And I'm like, Mortal Kombat is my own music.
Yeah.
This is the most me soundtrack I've ever written. So not necessarily. I mean, I have all kinds of weird stuff in my sketchbook you wouldn't believe. I mean, I write everything. So sometimes it might be like, hey, I just heard a J-pop tune in my head. Or maybe I had a dream and then like some country music. I mean, it literally everything. But, I sketch it out and it's just there in case I need it later on. But otherwise, I don't necessarily have any intentions right now about doing a next album. And I think the reason why is because I've been so lucky to have a variety of different types of projects. So I've never really felt like bored or like it's just a job or like, oh, another one of these or anything like that. I recently turned down a very major franchise sci-fi gig and recommended a friend of mine, like maybe you should hire this person instead. And the reason why was because I'm already doing like 3 sci-fi games at once. And I was just like, I don't know if I can figure out, at least not right now, something else that I could bring to the table.
Yeah. Would you feel you'd be in danger of kind of cannibalizing what you already put
Absolutely,
together?
Yeah.
Okay.
And one of them is this indie game, Anew, The Distant Light, which has just been my passion project for, I think, 4 years now. And it's got a very unique, it's probably the most unique game score that I have ever written and probably will write for quite some time. But it has a very specific sound. And if I were to do this title, then I would risk dipping into that a little too much. And same with the other title that I'm working on right now. It's like, you got to keep these separate and figure out how do they each have their own unique space. It's part of saying no to things is either I just don't have the time or energy to do it, or it's just I've just done too much of the same thing and I don't want to. The last thing I want is to be typecast. I like to do lots of different things. I'm a little upset that, the Dead Island 2 game that I scored and finished, once again, not only like the Star Wars one where we finished the 90-minute score and that got canceled. This one, it was like a 2-hour score and it all got canceled.
Oh, man.
But for that one, it was all California rock music. It had nothing to do with, it sounded completely different from anything that I'd done previously. But again, I always try to do things that are not, I don't want to ever write the same score twice, in other words. Sometimes that leads to me saying, thanks, but no thanks to certain projects. Yeah.
Do you think 4 is your limit right now? For like 4 projects at once?
The limit is more about how different they are.
Okay.
I'm going to stop that sentence because
sure. All right.
You know how
NDA helicopter just flew over our heads.
It did.
So,
yeah. Isn't that funny? Like you think you can only think like 5 words ahead of what you say, and then you're like, nah, I should probably leave it. At that. But,
yeah. Well, I'm just finally glad that the T800's been released for Mortal Kombat because I've been sitting on that one for a while.
Wait, it's released now, or
well, the trailer, we can talk about it now finally.
Yeah, they tell me nothing, so I was just as surprised as the internet was about that. And I got to say that CG Arnold is one of the best looking face models I've ever seen in a video game.
Yeah, for sure.
Kudos to the NetherRealm team on that because it just looked so incredible.
No, I did not know if Joker was going to happen 100%. So I still was surprised in that trailer as well. Watching Joker perform acts of mayhem in violent ways against this Mortal Kombat roster is going to be very satisfying, and I think a maybe slightly unhealthy way, but that's always been the separator between DC and Mortal Kombat is DC Comics is not going to want their characters to be ripped apart in fatalities and vice versa. But now we have one
That's right.
I'm guessing, and partial to promoting the Joker film with Joaquin Phoenix, is now we're going to have him in the MK roster, both being torn apart and whatever type of brutalities or fatalities he's going to come up with. And I'm excited to see that, because if you can imagine being a comic book artist or any type of fan of the Joker, I mean, like, how can we really unleash his mayhem in this quadrant of the Mortal Kombat violent space, right? Like, you probably couldn't do this in a mainstream comic book, but in the Mortal Kombat space, let's see what we can do. So kudos.
This is the first time that he's been in a full-on...
First time, yeah.
Interesting.
So first time any DC character has been in a Mortal Kombat game that allows fatalities.
Very interesting.
Kudos to all the people behind the scenes at DC and Warner Brothers that approved that.
Yeah.
Because, when they're trying to push PG-13 movies with this character being played by Jared Leto, they're not want to associate with that. Now we have a Joaquin Phoenix rated R, deep, dark analysis of society in general. At least that's what I'm thinking. I haven't seen the movie yet.
Yeah, me neither.
It just adds another level of maturity to the decision, where, especially, we've been asking for something like this for a while. But, I mean, we're getting Spawn.
Yeah.
We're getting Spawn, dude. I mean, I'm so excited for that.
The development of MK11 is playing out like fan fiction. Isn't that crazy? Like, everything that you wanted as a fan, like 10 years, whatever. We have Kerry Tagawa as Shang Tsung. We have Spawn. We have the Joker. We have, finally digitized actors again, but in 3D, which didn't even seem possible 5-10 years ago. It's all happening. It's so crazy.
It's amazing to watch Kerry Tagawa, his performance as Shang Tsung in the game, and just matches against Liu Kang, and hearing banter between him, or still being super flirty with Sonya. It feels like it feels like you're just watching a straight up sequel to the movie when you watch those matches. What magic. I mean, you couldn't have made a better decision. And I'm sure the SAG-AFTRA limitations, not using union actors in MK9, and I'm not sure if they could or not in MKX, was probably one of the factors, because I know they've been talking about it for a while. But now everything's SAG-AFTRA from the video game performances, so why not have them? And boom, it's an immediate fan favorite. And the game's doing incredibly well. I think one of the top-selling console games, or if not the top-selling console game for the quarter.
It's still number one, I think.
Yeah. I believe it.
Yeah,
I believe it. And
Modern Warfare is coming along.
I know. Gears just came out. I really, at first, I thought Gears 5 was a bit derivative. Like, I mean, honestly, folks, Marcus Phoenix has fought the Locust for how many years? And it's just like, I gotta fight him again. It's like, dude, rest. Just rest, bro. It's how I felt about Princess Leia and freaking Force Awakens. Like, you've been doing this for 30 years? Yeah. Take a break. The war's over. You don't have to fight anymore. But the action set pieces, a number of scenes, and the voice acting by all of the characters. I mean, Cole and Baird are classics from the previous ones, but very, very impressed with the performances. Writing was a little bit cheesy, sure. I mean, it's a big action game. It's like a big action flick, but you get what you pay for. And really enjoyed the ride. Really enjoyed how the open world didn't feel like a giant chore, like other open world games. I mean, call it but you're on a skiff going around the different areas, and it doesn't feel like a chore like a lot of other video games do. It seems like they kind of pad it by making it bigger and bigger and bigger, the open world, and it's like, oh, go collect 25 of these things. Like, oh, I don't have a chore to do? Thanks. I really recommend Gears 5. The multiplayer is pretty good. I was getting my butt kicked at first, then I just switched to Nasher and roll in front of people and take them out. So it's a lot of fun. Yeah. It's been a very weird couple months, just reflecting on the entire decade. And I think the pinnacle of the weirdness is that the most popular game on PC is World of Warcraft Classic, a game that came out over 15 years ago. And to me, it is kind of the best expression of video games right now, is that we're not liking the modern business decisions that are made in the gaming space. Everything, the chasing the trends when it came to Fortnite and that type of format, the Battle Royale format, chasing those trends and now trying to find out what's going to be next. And it's just been a kind of a sad state of affairs for some of these AAA video game companies that had to let a lot of people go or made some decisions that their fans don't. I mean, look at Blizzard. That whole Diablo, oh, you guys don't have phones? The Diablo Immortal thing was Not good. And people want to go back to that more classic style of we don't need all these systems in an MMO where we want to work with people and communicate to people. We don't want all these loot boxes in our modern day shooters. I want to play the game for 10 hours and work towards unlocking something. Mortal Kombat 11 is one of the best games out this year, hands down. But my one critique would be if I'm putting 15 hours into playing Katana, I probably should have all of her stuff unlocked after that amount of time. And that was my biggest gripe that I had with Injustice 2 is I played that game for 200 plus hours, but I still didn't have everything unlocked for Catwoman, even though I played her for all those hours. So I think there needs to be just this good balance of, there can be randomness for what you're rewarded, but there needs to be a time stop of like, if you've played Katana for 15 hours, you don't have everything unlocked. I think there's something that needs to be kind of perfected in the system.
Yeah, Tekken 7 had a system kind of like that, where it's like once you played a certain number of online matches, it just gives you everything. It says, you know what, here's 200 million G or whatever, and we'll unlock literally every costume piece, every ending, every whatever. Knock yourself out.
And I think the progression system is coming down to we want games as a service. We want people to be playing the games longer. I get that. I understand that, and I understand why, you have DLCs and these packs. You get people more excited, and there's more content down the line, and it prolongs the game's life. Cool. But if it's at the detriment of the whole game, like with Battlefield 5, that game was not ready when it was released, and I paid full price, and then it went on sale 3 weeks later for half price, and my brother got it for half price. I'm like, well, how do I feel as a full-paying customer, right? And I still don't feel I have the full game. So there is this anger, this backlash from the consumer that has been just getting sharper and sharper and sharper the more and more and more these AAA companies are making these type of decisions that is not the best for the consumer. And now I think what's really hit the nail on the head, or has been kind of the final nail in the coffin, has been the UK is saying that loot boxes is advertising gambling to kids, which I agree with. ESA says we disagree with that. Well, sorry, ESA, but for you to not even have a debate or to bring it up as a forum shows the moral bankruptcy that you have. You would rather get the payout from all the whales paying for these loot boxes than you would to actually assess and have an open dialogue going, maybe these practices are not the best for children, to advertise and to advocate gambling, which we saw on NBA 2K recently with the slot machine. So that is this huge kind of swelling frustration that's happening, at least from the consumer side, that I'm seeing getting louder and louder and louder as more and more Fallout 76 fiascos keep happening, right? And the few game developers that have really risen above that or have tried to stay out of it, which has been just kind of unique. But in your sensibility from a business standpoint, I mean, it seems games are doing just fine, right? I mean,
most of what I play is either fighting games or single player. So I've been kind of isolated from a lot of the things that folks are upset by. But I will make one observation. I think that as far as gamers are concerned, we just have a much shorter fuse than in previous generations. Like, for example, you see the Battle Royale explosion. That's only been going on for like 2 years, maybe, like whenever PUBG, and then everyone kind of dived onto that. But, ask yourself, how many World War II PlayStation 2 games were there? How many, like we've had many times in the past, if not literally every moment in the past, that there's been one genre that's kind of dominated for a little while and everyone kind of got in a game or two. And then it was like, okay, let's move on to the next thing. And then the next thing happened and dominated for a little while, and then they moved on. I think that's actually happening even faster now, which in a way is a good thing because it means that we'll move on and see new things more frequently. But just the way that the world works now, we're just at a much faster pace. And so it's easy to get lost in that and to think that, games aren't evolving, or like, why is everything the same? When in reality, actually, the things you're playing now are totally different from what you were playing, say, 5 years ago. I don't think you could have said that about any previous generation. But that's just my observation. I mean, I'm so big into like the Uncharted style action adventures, and Spider-Man is my jam right now.
Absolutely,
and
that's a great one.
Yeah, and as such, I'm kind of distanced from the gacha type gameplay and loot boxes and whatnot, because I don't think there's really anything like that in any of the stuff that I'm playing. But I do understand, especially if you've paid, $60 and maybe you're 15 years old. So that's like a significant amount of money. And now you also have to pay however much else in order to keep up with your friend who just bought this, I don't know, amazing gun that, is like the I win button or whatever, like I totally understand that that's very frustrating. And I think that developers are very receptive to it. Sometimes it's just, I hearken development to like just being on a gigantic ship from the 1700s. And when you want to turn, you can do it, but it takes a long, long time. And so I think that as long as we're a little bit patient, then we'll figure out some sort of an answer to it.
Yeah, I hope so.
It's just not immediate,
Well, and I think there's not a lot of confidence in a lot of the corporate leadership in the video game world. There is when it comes to like Nintendo, Sony for the most part, just because of how successful they've been recently. But a lot of people like to make the comparison of EA versus Nintendo. When Nintendo Wii U sales were not doing too hot, the president of Nintendo took just a $1 salary and didn't fire anybody. And then Activision, Blizzard, and EA have record profits, and they fire 400 and 800 staff respectively. Mm-hmm. So it's that type of attitude where if your corporation is answering more towards the investors than they are to the employees that make their company a success, the games are being hurt because of it as well, then that's just a bad apple that's going to kind of poison everything at the moment. I think that's where so much of this vitriolic response is coming from critics and reviewers and people like the Angry Joe and others that have been gamers for as long as I have been, where you paid $60, you got the $60 game, and if you had an expansion pack, it was $30 or whatever, and that was great. Done. Settled. You didn't have this iWin stuff. But I just hope it does get figured out, man. Just not a whole lot of sobering voices out there.
Well, to be honest, I have to give a lot of props to games journalism because they've been very good about not just reacting to this, but also covering it and going into detail about the things happening, like with the Activision layoffs and what it means. And they haven't just been. I mean, obviously, it's important that they have a reaction, but it hasn't just been like the hot takes or whatever. But instead, you see very in-depth articles that go into very great interviews and talking about the employees and really humanizing us and making it very clear to gamers that these are real people that have been laid off or their games canceled or whatever. And I don't think that it would have been quite as clean if it weren't for these great articles that have come out recently. Not even just about layoffs, but also about working conditions and long hours and such. I think it's great that we have such powerful journalism in this industry that's really covering that and making sure that we see the full picture and not just the instant knee-jerk reactions to it. Yeah,
the full picture is very important, and it takes a mature, sensible voice to give us that full picture. And we've had a number of good articles. One that was on esports a little while ago, showing how much of a bubble it's in, which was a lot of real talk that I've been talking about for a while, and others, friends of mine, that have been saying the same thing. And seeing more and more of that just cold hard facts journalism come out. It's been great. Happy to see it for sure. The only thing really that's going to stop the practices that we don't like from the major corporations in video games is don't give them any money or don't buy the loot boxes and don't buy these things. That's the best way to kind of send that message. But we'll see. It's just been a very torrential decade in terms of how much stuff has changed, trends, popularity. But you're absolutely right. The internet, most games are going digital now, and most games are going to be already are being bought and sold digitally. GameStop's probably not going to be around the next couple of years, even though they're trying to hold on as long as they can.
They're very smart people. I think they'll find ways to evolve. Personally.
They're closing 200 stores right now.
Yeah?
So yeah, that was just
But do
announced.
they have an online storefront? And
Yeah, their online storefront is there. You can pick up in the store, or they can ship it to you. But it's the same as Amazon. You know, that's again, it's all of retail. It's not just GameStop. Retail is in that spot. I worked with GameStop, and speaking of trying to steer a ship, it was so many things were falling on deaf ears. You know, we want to do esports,
really?
we want to do this, we want to do that, and things were not done that should have been done from the highest levels multiple times. Like, I'll give you a very specific example. If I get in trouble for it, so be it. We were doing GameStop Hometown Heroes, and it was my understanding after flying to Texas and having meetings with the GameStop folks that they were going to inform the stores we were doing the finals in. We identified the stores. They gave us the address. Said, okay, great. Can you let your managers know this is what we're going to be doing? And I'll call them 2 months in advance. They said, great. I call them 2 months in advance. Not one single store knows what's going on.
Oh, no.
They refer me to, you need to call the corporate office. Like, I had a literal meeting face-to-face with the corporate office. This is the plan. They haven't told you anything? No. Okay, so I call the corporate guys. Give them a month to get their stuff together. I call the stores again. I'm sorry, we don't know what you're talking about, sir. I'm like, you have a tournament in your store for Injustice 2 in 1 month, exactly 1 month from now. You haven't received any of this, any of that? So no, no. GameStop, I would not want to work with ever again.
That's unfortunate.
The employees and the territorial managers are super passionate people that work very, very hard to do the best they can with what they got. But the top-down leadership approach, either too many cooks in the kitchen or they're holding on to an old business practice of trying to sell retail and people are in the store and not branching out and do other things. If I'm wrong, if there's still a GameStop a couple years from now, cool. There's a physical location people can go to celebrate their game fandom and maybe pick up a couple
there's so much power
things.
to that.
Yeah.
You would think that they would embrace.
But they're not capitalizing on the real estate power, which is why they're closing another 200 stores.
That's unfortunate.
It is very unfortunate, dude. So I wish them the best of luck, but you have to go with the customer experience. And if my experience of purchasing the game is so much easier and fulfilling by pressing a couple buttons and boom, I can download it with my 1 gig internet speeds.
Yeah.
Why would I want to go to a store? Unless that
Exactly.
store either has a specific collectible or that store has a specific promotion. And the promotions in GameStop aren't good enough for me to not buy digitally. That's the current trend. But again, it's technology, following where technology is going. And if you know that you're not going to be pushing as much game sales out of your physical location, then you have to push the experience. And this is the only way that retail is going to survive. If I walk into a clothing store, I want somebody to be like, looks like you're a large XL. We'll get you a couple things that you can try on. Great. Cool. Tried a couple outfits on. They look great. They'll be shipped to you in 2 days. Done. Good to go. Instead of having all of this backlot stuff for everything in a warehouse. There's better approaches to it that use the technology that we have access to today that still gives it the human customer approach. Because the one thing people can offer in a store that I can't get online is the human connection. Yeah. And that can make or break a sale. Or trying something on and physically trying it on.
Like try out the game.
Or try out the game.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's tough because, you think somebody smarter than me was going to figure this out, right? And you're looking around going, is that person here? Are they here? But hey, so be it. I mean, retail is where it's at now. We'll find out where it's going to be in the next couple of years, just overall. Anyways, let's talk about Tokyo. You went to the Tokyo Game Show.
Yes, it was my first time in Tokyo and in Japan.
Oh
in
my
Asia.
gosh. All right. Yeah. So we had met. You came over to White Swan Public House before you left, right? So tell me what the journey was like. How was the plane ride? Because I've been to China and Korea, but I haven't been to Japan. I'd love to go to Japan.
Oh, man. I didn't even know where to begin. I mean, first off, it was a very short trip because I had to get back to work. But I'd been telling myself, like, you got to go to Japan. You got to, I have so many friends, especially in Tokyo and these different game companies and whatnot, game and anime. And so you got to check it out. And for years and years, I procrastinated. And finally this year I was like, dang it, Mortal Kombat came out. I'm going, whatever. I didn't realize that they don't sell Mortal Kombat in Japan, so that was completely arbitrary. But still, it was about time, and it was fantastic. I mean, first off, it's impossible to get a bad meal in Tokyo. It's the food is out of control good. I don't even know how to describe it because it's very different from Western sensibilities. Like, it got to a point where, I stayed at a really nice hotel with this great restaurant buffet kind of situation. And it got to a point where I would just see food and put it on my plate. And I would have no idea what it was, but I knew it would be good. And that's just kind of the way Japanese food works. It's like, you know what, it's small. Just put it in your mouth. Don't think about what it is. Just eat it. And it was so incredibly good. I had the best ramen of my life. I'm a huge ramen fan, and nothing compares to the Tokyo. You enter the machine, put in what you want, and then wait outside, and then go in and have the best ramen of your life.
Man.
It was incredible. I got to hang out with some amazing musicians, some of which I just met, but they're unbelievably generous. And in addition to being crazy talented, like, I was a big fan of this one vocalist and lyricist called MPI, who he worked on like Attack on Titan and Kill la Kill and Xenoblade Chronicles X, which coincidentally is actually my favorite Nintendo soundtrack, which sounds blasphemous, but it's such a far left field score that no one else would have thought of except for Sawano-san.
And that's the one that's on the Switch right now, correct?
No, it's on Wii U.
Oh,
it's
wow.
the previous one.
Gotcha. All right.
Xenoblade 2 is on Switch right now. I'm not as familiar with that, but it felt very anime, lots of songs, vocal songs and whatnot. I met him, and it was just so fantastic. We were just talking about all the philosophies of music, and he introduced me to all this great food that I'd never tried before. And literally everyone that I met in Japan was like that. Incredibly generous, super polite. My very first time at Tokyo Station, which is kind of the main station of town, and my hotel was right across the street from it. I just thought to myself, man, there's no way this would ever work in America. We're talking about a train station that's so big. It's like 5 floors deep and almost a mile wide. And you can easily get lost. Everything is in Japanese. So if you don't read Japanese, then, good luck. And I didn't. And I had all my luggage, and it was sweltering hot and humid. And I'm just thinking, well, I could die here. So it's been a good ride, but yeah, everyone was super helpful and explained that just keep going up and you'll eventually reach the surface. And it's just very different, but in a really great way. Everyone's very respectful, very polite, and everything is run according to a very logical grid, I guess, except for the streets. The streets make no sense whatsoever. If you don't know the layout of the land or you're not following a map, you will get lost so easily because there's no actual grid.
Yeah.
But other than that, the subways were great. Easily find your way anywhere in town, and very quickly as well. And Tokyo Game Show itself was fantastic. It's way bigger than I thought it would be. It's literally 3 times as big as, I think, the Game Developers Conference Expo.
Wow.
It's like, imagine that, but bigger times 3.
Okay.
There's 3 different halls.
Have you been to E3, bigger than E3?
Is it bigger than E3? Well, E3, I would say it's... So E3 is like 2 halls like that. Yeah. Imagine a third.
Okay.
Actually, a fourth.
So this is like Gamescom level, would you say?
I've never been to Gamescom.
Oh, all right. Gamescom is super packed. It's a lot of people. All right, cool.
Yeah.
I can get the sensibility. A lot of people. So there's like a sea of people sometimes when you walk through one of the halls, right? Just
actually, the nice thing about TGS was that the first 2 days were industry only.
Awesome.
And that's the only time I went. So it wasn't really that crowded. Still quite a lot of people, but, easy breathing room. Supposedly when it opens to the public, then it's like everyone's right up next. But again, it's Japan. People are very polite, respectful, so they can get away with it. Like a presentation goes up, or, Keanu Reeves shows up, whatever. And people just calmly turn around. It's not like, out of my way, like you probably
free
have
stuff.
Here. Yeah, exactly. It's just like, okay, let's very calmly handle this situation. None of us are more important than the person next to him. and it just kind of it worked out really well.
Cool. What did you see anything that impressed you at the Tokyo Game Show this year?
Yeah, I saw the Death Stranding new gameplay.
Like that 15-minute demo.
Yeah. Okay. And the more I see of that game, the less I understand it. But
it just leaves you with more questions than answers.
I just have many questions, but I mean, that's kind of part of the appeal. Really digging the visual look, the music, and really everything about it. So I'm really looking forward to playing that one. I didn't really see too much. I actually didn't spend much time on the show floor. What people don't realize until you get there is that the Tokyo Game Show is nowhere near Tokyo. It's actually in Chiba, which is like an hour away. So it's not, you basically have to say like, I'm going to dedicate 3 or 4 hours to just walk around for 1 hour. And then go back to Tokyo because all the parties and get-togethers are in Tokyo proper. So I didn't really spend too much time there. It was more about, saying hi to some folks and checking out some of like the PlayStation area. Square Enix, of course, I had to get there. I had all the silly Square Enix photos with like the Buster Sword and all that. Had to do that. But really, it was more about the people and reconnecting with folks that I'd met in the past and meeting some of my like video game music heroes. Like I'm now friends with. I used to be huge into like Virtua Fighter, and super huge into like the Virtua Fighter 2 and 3 soundtracks, and I befriended the composer from them. You may also know him as the voice of like Daytona, like the Daytona arcade music. And he was super nice, invited me to a game dev party. We hung out and stuff. So it was really cool. And like, other folks I can't really talk about, but, it was great seeing their offices and whatnot. And the inner sanctum of like these games that I've loved for decades.
Yeah.
It was amazing.
How long was the flight?
It's like 9 hours going to Tokyo and only 7 coming back.
Okay.
So it's not that bad from here in Seattle. Direct flight, too, from Seattle to Narita.
Nice. So how long have you lived in Seattle? Because you and I have talked about LA in the past, and we're both not really gung-ho to move back to that city.
Yeah. Wait, you lived in LA?
I lived in LA,
yeah.
Cool. I lived in LA for about a total of a decade.
Oh,
overall.
I didn't know that. Cool.
Yeah.
Where were you from originally?
From here. I was born in Vancouver, Washington, which is down south, and then I grew up in Federal Way, which is about a 20-minute drive south of here.
Okay.
And I was there till 14, then went to Kansas, Virginia, Utah, Virginia, California, Washington. Wow. That's been where I've gone. But yeah, I was living in Burbank, working full-time in esports and doing the acting thing. Until a year and a half ago, where I had an opportunity to live here rent-free. This house is paid off, but I pay the property taxes. My parents inherited it from my grandparents. They passed away, and they're living in Virginia right now. And so I had the opportunity to build my own podcast studio and learn how to bartend out here, man. But I truly love Seattle. I've enjoyed visiting this city when I was living in LA because I would typically host at PAX West. And every time I was enjoying the city as an adult, because living at 14, I really don't have a whole lot of independence to enjoy the place around you. But the more and more I would visit, the more and more I would enjoy it. And then it got to a point, both in my career and my personal life, that moving up to this city was going to be the best decision that I could make. And it was, and I did, and so far it has been. I enjoy just the overall history of the area, how it was built off of brothels and lumberjacks.
I did not know that.
Yeah. So a real quick history. The United States government wanted to harvest this land as much as possible, but Canada was also coming down. So they were sending lumberjacks out here, men out here, as much as they could. And then a couple entrepreneurs noticed that there's a bunch of men and not a whole lot of women. And so they had owned a couple brothels along San Francisco and the California line, and they asked some of the older ladies that weren't getting as much clientele, do you want to move up to Seattle and start a new life up there? And they said, sure. And they became the 12 first families of Seattle, because as soon as those ladies got off the boat, men were like, we got women in the town now. And those women became super powerful and super rich and really owned the town for quite a number of years. So yeah, this city's based off a lot of progressive ideals. But I grew up doing martial arts. I grew up playing Half-Life. Sierra Publishing was out of here. Microsoft was here. So just kind of that whole video game vibe, technology vibe was definitely entrenched in the space. But then I wanted to come back because of seasons. I wanted to live in a place that actually had rain,
Yeah.
maybe a little bit of snow, some sun, and some, and some changing colors of the leaves. So after being in an apartment in Burbank, California for a number of years with no AC, I wanted to live in a place that had, seasons. So that was another reason why I wanted to get out of LA. But what about you? Where are you originally from, and why do you like to have Seattle be the place that you kick it?
So almost the exact opposite. I grew up in Philadelphia, and boy, do we have seasons. Every season in Philadelphia wants to kill you. They all want to kill you, and they succeed sometimes, very unfortunately. The winter is you will die, and the summer you will die, and spring and autumn are beautiful there. But man, it's just so extreme that you wonder, why does anyone live here? This is ridiculous, and it only gets worse the further north you go. Like I was in college in New Haven, Connecticut, and it's right near the Long Island Sound, so the summers are extremely humid, and then the winters are extremely humid too. And if you've ever experienced a humid winter, it's basically, it doesn't matter how much you put on.
Nope.
You're going to freeze. And then as soon as you go inside, you're sweating. It's the worst. So when I moved to San Francisco in 2008, that was like, yes, I don't have to worry about the weather every single day and worry about not dying because of it. But instead, it's like, okay, you're a little cold all year round for some reason, but nonetheless, it's pretty much staying around 60 to 70 degrees. I loved that. But the Seattle move was about 5 years ago, and it was mostly because after the end of LucasArts, I wrapped up my Lara Croft Temple of Osiris score and realized, there's nothing really tethering me to San Francisco anymore, and I'm not really a West Coaster at heart. So, I'm free to kind of go wherever I want. And most of my friends moved up to Seattle for Microsoft and Bungie and whatnot. So I figured, let's just give it a shot. And I visited, and it was amazing because I visited in the summer.
Yes.
And then I got there in, I think, November, and it was a very different experience. Very different.
Yeah.
But still, I've really appreciated especially the audio industry here, in particular game and film music as well as game audio. We have, I think, the greatest game audio community in the world here, because if you look at it, we have all these AAA developers, Bungie, 343, Valve, Sucker Punch, which is Sony, all these great studios, ArenaNet. And we also have schools. We have DigiPen, and we have Cornish, and as well the Pacific Northwest Film Music School. And we also have everything in between. We have lots of indies. We have lots of VR. So when we have our meetups, which I think are usually every 2 months or so, everyone is there. It'll be 50 people, all very excited about game audio, and it's a mix of freelancers and in-house people, newcomers and veterans, and everything in between. And so they end up being great conversations. The studios are very gracious hosts as well. Sometimes we'll have a meetup, and it'll be at ArenaNet or at Microsoft or somewhere. In addition to that, I feel like I'm just giving a pitch to hey, come to Seattle.
That's why we're doing it.
Additionally, we also have, I think, once or twice a year, we have a big meetup in Bellingham, Washington, which is a combination of the Seattle game audio and Vancouver, Canada game audio communities, because it's just about halfway. And that's a fantastic full day event where there's the networking and just free hanging out, but there's also a few lectures that are prepared. And then there's unprepared lectures, which is also one of the coolest things, where, it's in a classroom and they'll just, write up topics on the board. People will raise their hand and suggest a topic for someone to talk about. And then they'll nominate random people to talk about that, who they think should be able to speak on that subject. And then in pairs, they just come up to the front of the room and extemporaneously give a 3-minute talk about whatever the topic was. And it's just one of the most fun things that I've experienced in game audio. It's great for fellowship. It's great for inclusivity as well. And we're trying to capitalize that as much as possible on getting a lot of people into the industry, and working with students and recent graduates as well. So I think Seattle's got one of the healthiest game audio communities, which is really that's kind of what's been keeping me going. Additionally, Seattle is it's got a great vibe for creativity, I think, because, I mean, you can get lost on the way home and accidentally run into like a forest or a lake. Or I live right by the lake because I'm near Green Lake. And, one time I went to the what's it called? Like the big university shopping mall area. I forget what it's called. What? University Village, maybe?
Yeah,
something like that. And I was riding my bike and I couldn't go back the way I went. So Google Maps directed me through the forest. And then it started raining, so I had to divert or whatever. And suddenly I lost sight of civilization. And now I'm surrounded by this forest. And then literally a lake happened. And I'm like, why am I at a lake now? And then somehow civilization, and I hit like the warp point. And that's Seattle. It's just all these different climates. And then, of course, we have the mountain, which is like right there somewhere. Yeah. So it's very inspiring to see all of this. No matter where you go, it's picturesque. You can look out and see for miles from pretty much any direction. And it's just really great for having an inspiring city. Where I live is somewhat quiet, which is great. But also it's just like 3 blocks from, some really great 45th Street or Avenue or whatever, bars and restaurants and whatnot. So yeah, I'm really happy. I think it's my favorite neighborhood I've ever lived in. And,
awesome. That's great to hear.
Yeah.
One of the words that comes to mind when I think of Seattle is authenticity. In stark contrast to Los Angeles. I mean, Los Angeles is a city built on a fantasy because they didn't have any water until I started to get pumped into the 1940s and 50s.
Yeah.
So many people are striving for the same thing, and I think one of the best ways that's encapsulated and expressed is in the film La La Land. Which I actually have a signed poster of that in my parlor room that I got from helping to promote the company or promote the film. That film, at the beginning, you see Emma Stone walk into an audition room, and there's like 15 other women that look just like her with red hair and wearing the same top and same color pants. And I go, yeah, that's LA. That's when you go to those audition room and it's like, oh, I'm unique. I'm different. I did great in high school. And, I stood out. And then you go to that town and great, you're 1 in 15 people that did that exact same thing. And let's see how you're going to be for this project. Oh, and by the way, how many Twitter followers do you have? Which I understand why that asks that question, but at the same time, it hurts me because what should matter is that person right for the role or right for the show, not just how many Twitter followers they have. So there is that level of authenticity that I feel in the city. And I'm really jealous that you have that type of community that you guys get together and have that. One of the things that I'm doing in my life is pivoting more towards performance again, not just being a host, but singing and dancing and acting. And theater here is very prominent, or at least a city that has some good theater. So that's the type of community I want to start to get more involved in and to go to workshops or if somebody's doing this or everybody's going to go a show that night. I need to get involved more in that community. And it's tough because I have to branch out and meet some new people and make some new friends, but I have a great baseline of friends and people that are already performance artists who you got to meet. One of them, Roman, who's the head chef now at White Swan Public House. That have worked in the service industry, and that's a great industry to get to learn the city for sure. But so many creative people work in that industry, so I've had some outlets and some, fun hangout sessions to talk about that stuff. But I really miss it, and that's one of the things that I'm kind of looking in what I want to do this fall. It's different than what I've been doing. That's getting more involved in the theater scene. So hopefully I can find that. I'm sure I can in this city because there's a lot of great theater here, and I fell in love with theater because of this city. The first show that I saw that was Broadway-esque was Miss Saigon, which, speaking of sound effects and sound design, they fly in a real chassis of a helicopter for a rescue scene, and you hear that thing whirling. Now, it's not really whirling because it's just a chassis. You can't see the props up above, but it sounds like it. I was so blown away. But how do they land a chopper inside? Then you realize, no, it was all sound design and smoke and mirrors. So if I could have that level of thunder.
That sounded awesome.
Yeah, that's this thing here. That's Raiden's entrance music. But to have that memory has really inspired me to be like, okay, I need to get back into this world, get back into this scene.
You should come to our audio meetup sometime.
I would. Let me know, man. I'd love to meet some people out there.
I'll give you the info after.
Sweet.
After this,
Sing some praises to the audio folks, because the funniest thing about audio is that you don't notice it until it's bad. At least in life scenarios. When there's a joke NASL sound guy that we had in the esports world, where if the sound was off for any production, people were like, "Oh, it's the NASL sound guy," because the sound was always off for a lot of our productions. Funny inside jokes. All right, we're going to take another question from chat, and I'm going to ask you about LucasArts, then we're going to wrap up here.
Sure.
This one is from Matthias Souza. He asks, "Can you tell more about the different sound processing techniques you use, like the super slowed down string pizzicato? Also turn those cranks." So it sounds like it's a bit of an inside joke there.
So Matthias is you know how when you end a round in Mortal Kombat and it has that sort of violin piece? That's Matthias playing the violin.
Oh, yeah. Right on, man.
He's one of my
that's awesome
bandmates, and also the in a band I'm in, Disco Cactus. Long story.
Okay.
And also he's fellow Yale graduate, and so we work together on this one. So to answer the question, so one of the other first things I did when even just conceiving the main theme is I thought of the concept of time. Kronika manipulates time. That's one of her powers. I'll get into the other one in a sec. But I thought, well, how can I use that, or how can I portray that musically? And I found that I have this program called Paul Stretch, which allows you to take any piece of audio and slow it down like 1,000 times. I mean, like make things so slow that like if I do that, it can be like a long pad that just goes on forever. So what I did was I said, okay, I think what he's talking about is the scene where Kronika visits Jax, and Jax is this is like halfway through
in
the
his
game.
apartment. Yeah,
and he's down on his luck and all that. And I wanted to portray musically the idea of like, hey, the rest of this whole world is now frozen while she's speaking to him and manipulating him. And also manipulation is her other superpower.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, Rich, the audio director, would argue that is her main superpower, is being able to manipulate people. So I wanted to combine those two things, the manipulation and the time powers. So in that piece, the background chords are actually just a string orchestra playing little pizzicatos, which is when you take the string and just go, boop. It's just this tiny little short sound. But I used the Paul Stretch to stretch it out to like a minute long. And so it's just a whole chord progression of these stretched out pizzicatos as the background. And the foreground, I wanted it to sound like the bowed string ideas from the main theme, like that, her main melody, the that whole thing. But I didn't want it to use the kemenche, which is the Middle Eastern violin that I used in the main theme, because I wanted it to appeal to Jax, that she's a manipulator. That's all she's doing. And so I wanted it to appear in a form that he would be more accustomed to. And Jax is American, so here's like a regular violin, but it's playing all this swirly kind of stuff. So I wrote that as a way to like bring her into the scene as this sort of otherworldly thing, kind of showing off her power. She's kind of flexing on him a little bit, just showing up everywhere. And so that's where that comes in. And then as the piece progresses, what I found a lot of fun is that, she's, I don't remember exactly the line, but she's basically outlining a different universe for Jax. You could have been a General Jackson Briggs, and your daughter would never have risked her life joining the military, but instead she would be, she would be giving you grandchildren and all that. She's just painting this whole picture. Nothing happens in that scene. The camera just kind of moves in a little bit closer to Kronika, and she's sort of looking up into the air. And it was my job to paint that scene and make it, come alive in the viewers' minds, even though nothing is happening on screen. So that's where all of the string effects and whatnot come in, and everything is just kind of rising, and it uses the family theme leitmotif while she's outlining this alternate future for Jax. Anyway, that's very long-winded, but that's sort of why I used all this different time manipulation stuff in the score, was to show her powers and to integrate that into different parts of the story, where she's doing different things in her manipulations of the characters.
And it makes her power more real, because if you're not seeing something physically happening other than her dialogue and how Jax is reacting, then you can punctuate that. But you have those visuals when you're really doing the final piece to make sure that it's punctuated and it feels right. More or less, you got some previs stuff.
There's a lot
maybe.
of grayscale and untextured faces and like people walking around like this, you know. I think the other time that the other two times that I extensively used time manipulation were in the Timequake scene, where Kronika first uses her powers to flip time on itself and bring the past into the present. So I did a lot with the orchestra, kind of these matrixy effects where different parts of the orchestra are playing in different tempos from each other. So the trumpets and the horns, which I recorded live in Budapest, they're playing this figure, this kind of very matrixy kind of figure that just keeps getting faster and faster and faster. And then the rest of the orchestra is like reacting to that, but at their own tempo. And when it comes to a climax and you see the hourglass itself, I took the orchestra chord that happened to have been playing, I think it's E flat major or something, and I have it very gradually, to the point where you can't even notice it, crossfade into the stretched out version. So it sounds like time is just slowly coming to a halt and then just stopping. And then I put some other swirly effect on the whole orchestra, so it sounds like now time is like flipping upside down and stuff with like a phaser or something. And then I guess lastly, another place where Mateus played was towards the end, where once again Kronika stops time but then rewinds it. And I wanted it to have, and this may be another place where the Lord of the Rings sound, people kind of think of that. I wanted it to sound regretful. But also, I wanted it to sound like you have a cassette tape and you've started to rewind it too fast or whatever. So, you know, Liu Kang is reaching out to Katana, who's inexplicably stopped moving. And now this very high-pitched and longing violin solo plays that's very similar to what we had with Jax. But now it's layered and it has all this different... what's called arpeggios, which is where they're kind of playing this very virtuosic, very fast notes really, you know, quickly and layered on top of each other, and freely timed. So there isn't even a tempo. It's just three violins playing, each at their own tempo. Wow. Just kind of layering on top of each other. And then the special effects make it sound like there's, 103 as it just gradually gets more and more complicated and the rewinding gets faster and faster and faster.
Dang. That sounds, it's so cool how you are able to express that idea of altering time just from your contribution to the music side. Then add the visuals and the dialogue, and then you put together something captivating. But that's, in essence, what film has been, the combination of light, images, and music and sound put together. But now with video games, you add a controller. You add the person that can manipulate everything.
Yeah. The one of the big differences between this score and my Call of Duty score was I wanted to... Like, Call of Duty was much more supportive because the acting was so foregrounded and the story is so real that doing anything ornate would have been inappropriate. But for this score, my direction to myself was you should be able to understand what's happening even if you don't see the visuals at all. You should be able to just listen to the music and kind of figure out what's going on, and maybe some dialogue or whatever, but you should be able to understand everything. So it actually does get quite literal at times.
Yeah, that's what makes a great score, because you can pop it in on Spotify and be like, oh, this is the part where Liu Kang did this, and you're remembering it.
Yeah.
Same with my favorite film scores. All right, we got a little bit more time. Tell me about LucasArts. What was that experience like? And are you optimistic for the next film, for episode 9?
Yeah, so I started LucasArts in 2008, I want to say. And I started just as like a music assistant. So like bottom of the food chain, I had an opportunity to join there when they were working on the Force Unleashed series. Previously, they only had one employee doing anything music, the music supervisor, and he was just so backlogged with tasks, and it was just getting unreasonable.
And that was for all the LucasArts games, right?
He had to work on everything, and he eventually said, "This is ridiculous. I'm not seeing, my family, so we need someone else." So someone else I was friends with in the department suggested me, and they eventually hired me. What was kind of cool is I was able to grow that into a composition job as well as implementation, so doing the tech stuff. So once we finished Force Unleashed, I taught myself Python scripting as well as Lua scripting so that I could help out more with the tech side, which is where I saw we were really falling behind on that, and we were relying too much on other departments. So I figured, well, I'm here, I should be able to help with that.
And when you describe Python scripting, you would write the script and then attach whatever file, and you'd be like, here's the script, here's the code, and hand it off instead of them trying to write the code after you.
Sort of.
It's kind of like that? Okay.
Kind of. I mean, a lot of it was, if you need music to play at this part of the level, there's usually 2 or 3 ways to do it. And I wanted to make sure that we could do all 3 ways on our own within the audio team without having to ask the level designers to do it every single time. And so, I would be able to do that sleuthing and figuring out, how to get music to play and fixing bugs on our own instead of having to rely on a level designer who has a million other things to worry about.
So you help alleviate the load for the whole team then.
Exactly, yeah. And after that, one day, and this, as the story goes, one day I overheard the music supervisor talking to the audio director, mentioning that they needed another composer for Star Wars: The Old Republic, the MMO.
Oh, I played the hell out of that game. So
really?
Yeah, I did.
And I figured, I'm already here. You don't have to pay me anything. So literally that night, I went home, wrote a demo piece, and brought in the next day, and kind of forced them to listen to it. And eventually they let me write music for the game. It's the first time I'd ever worked with a full live orchestra and choir. I ended up writing for several planets like Tython, Tatooine, Taurus, Nar Shaddaa, some others I don't really quite remember.
Were you there when they were recording the orchestra and the choir? Were you in the room?
Yeah.
Did you give notes to the composer?
The conductor,
I'm sorry, the conductor? Yeah.
Yeah.
That's funny.
Because it was crazy.
Growing up and being a member of the choir and singing and always following whatever the conductor does, you have to do what he says. That's rule number 1, 2, and 3. Or she. You have to do whatever the conductor says. Just to see somebody to give notes to a conductor is something I would always want to see in my life. You're like, oh no, it needs to be done this way. Because you never second guess the conductor unless the person who's actually writing the music. Yeah. Well, that's amazing, man. I'm sure that must have been quite a thrill to have your composition being performed by a full orchestra.
It was terrifying. I mean, it's gotten less terrifying as time went on, but that first time it was just like, oh, what do I do? But eventually by now it's a little bit more, I kind of get how to write music that's easily playable, but also compelling. Mortal Kombat was terrifying as well, but for a different reason. We recorded in Budapest, Hungary, but remotely. So I was still here in Seattle and we just used Skype. So you got to think, all right, I only got, so much of their time and then they go home, but I have to talk to my contractor and type out to them. And the contractor is German. So then he had to then translate into Hungarian for the conductor and the orchestra, and then just all the delay.
Jeez.
And I reasoned it that every second costs like $5. If you think about it, every
second was $5
because of everyone in the room or something like that, like $1 or $5 on that scale. So it's like you choose your words very carefully.
Mezzo forte, and you have to wait 15 seconds for it to be translated, and then okay, once more.
Just that 8 measures of the main theme when the horns come in. It took about 15 minutes, and it was terrifying because you didn't. I mean, that's a long stretch of time when you have so much else to do. So that was the most terrifying. But anyway, back to LucasArts. After the Old Republic, I worked on the Monkey Island Special Edition. The second one, I was the music supervisor, and it was my job to figure out how they did all of this really complicated interactive music. But now, not only do I have to replicate it, but also we were doing it with live instruments. So I had to figure out a budget and figure out how do we stretch this tiny budget through the entire game and make it work with all this interactivity. And I think I had like half the amount of time that they had for the first Monkey Island games.
Jeez.
With about 10 times as much music. So it was pretty crazy. But it was an amazing experience as well. And once I kind of did that, that sort of proved myself, I guess, to the team. And they're like, oh, he can handle whatever. So finally, the last LucasArts game was Star Wars First Assault. And that was a PSN and Xbox Live multiplayer competitive shooter, multiplayer only. Unfortunately, it didn't get released, but we pretty much finished the game. We got to the final post-alpha where we're like a couple weeks away from submitting to Microsoft for the certification or whatever. It's the most. I think actually it's the best game I ever worked on at LucasArts. Easily the most fun. And I had such a blast. I was on it for about 2 years. I designed a very elaborate music interactivity system, which was based on every individual player's experience. So it would look into statistics of what was happening from this player's perspective. And then it would also look at the player's situation, like are you near your teammates or are you near a capture point or are enemies nearby or whatever. And it would decide not only what music to play, but also when to play it. During the rounds, and that really helped to give it a very Star Warsy feel, but also it gave you, like, it wasn't obtrusive. It really stood in the background in the exact correct way and was musical when it needed to be. And it was a unique story, too. It was all about the stormtroopers and the rebels. There were no, like, hero characters or big Sith or Jedi or anything. It was about the reality of war. And that required a different musical approach than the films, because the films are all about the larger-than-life epic story.
The space opera.
Exactly, yeah. Whereas this is, I mean, not reality, but it's closer to that. It took that, and it said, well, what's the human side of this? What is it like when you are you're a young person from wherever, and you decide, I want to help make the world a safer place. So you go and you become a stormtrooper. You've done that from a positive standpoint. You're not, I'm going to go be evil, but instead you want to bring peace to the galaxy. So you join that. So they had that angle. Or maybe you're from an outer rim planet and the war just shows up to your doorstep. And you're like, well, I have to rebel. So you join the rebellion. What does that sound like? And so it was sort of like two different soundtracks. The Stormtroopers being more of like a military heroism with the Star Wars Ep 3 kind of vibe to it, but with more of like a heart. The main theme, I remember, used the Imperial March, but it put it actually in the major key to sort of show this heroism side of it. And also with a lot of like Medal of Honor influence, the Michael Giacchino original scores.
Yes.
And then the Rebel side sounded a lot more like Firefly, if you remember that TV show. It was lots of world instruments. It was a much more stripped down orchestra. This is where I had that thing I talked about previously with like the silver and gray and blue sounds over here with the Imperials, and then the reds and yellows and earth tones for the Rebels, because it sounded more personal.
It's the plight, you have the plight of the Rebels versus the crushing industry of the Imperials.
In a way, yeah, absolutely. We recorded the score with the London Symphony Orchestra at Abbey Road. Curiously, right at the same time as the 2012 London Olympics. So I get to say that I bumped the Olympics by a couple of weeks because they had to record my stuff first.
Wow, nice.
But yeah, they fantastic performances all around. We had some of the performers from Mortal Kombat actually played on that score as well. Herman Whitcomb, who played Duduk on both scores, and Sebastian Frey, who played cello on both scores. And I believe Doug Perry was percussion on both as well. He definitely was on Mortal Kombat. But yeah, the whole thing recorded and everything is finished. And unfortunately, Kathleen Kennedy got us all in a room on a Wednesday and said, hey, there's no easy way to say this, but it's over. And, get your stuff by Friday. So at least she gave us 2 days to get our stuff. But it was very heartbreaking, as you might imagine.
Now, this was after the acquisition from Disney. Kathleen Kennedy takes over all of Lucasfilm, including LucasArts. And the game that you mentioned, along with 1313, was the other game in development, just shut down, done, over. And what was the repercussion after that, or at least the consequences after that for the consumer? EA gets the contract to design all the major titles, and we get 2 Battlefront games that underperform.
Did they? I mean,
yeah, the loot box fiasco killed the second one. Now it's in a good state, and I went back and played it, and it's in a way better state than when it was when it came out. So a lot of people have that what if theory of if those games came out, would things be different? Yeah, possibly. Who knows? That's just the unfortunate consequences of major corporate acquisitions. Is if Disney, because Disney have their own interactive studio, but they haven't really been making anything out of that studio for a while. They shut that down. Yeah. So they just wanted a contract out, it seemed like. But that must have been a bummer, man, because you've been working on that for 2 years, and you're super excited about all the systems and feats that you put into it, and then it just shut down.
I mean, it was easily the best thing I'd ever written up until that point. And of course, with the orchestra and all that. And actually, I got to give a huge shout out to the sound design team, because it was one of the best sounding games I thought that I'd ever worked on. But I mean, for the PlayStation 3 and Xbox era, I mean, there was some very forward thinking stuff with sort of like a modified high dynamic range kind of thing that we did. So like distance modeling was done really well. And I mean, it was a huge shame. For a while I was thinking like, man, if only that game came out, what my career would be like, I would be the man and all that. But honestly, fate has a way of being cyclical if you just kind of stick to it. And I never gave up. I mean, by all rights, I probably should have given up, but I didn't. And time went on, and it turned out that, I still had, the CD of some of the music. And when I was talking with Dave Swenson from Sledgehammer Games, and, we got kind of into talks about whatever their next game was. They couldn't just flat out tell me it was Call of Duty.
Sure.
But, we got into talks. And eventually I said, hey, man, this isn't really Call of Duty music, but here's this CD of music I did for this other game, which is kind of similar, where we tried to take Star Wars and make it real into the soldier's tale. And he keeps telling me that that's the exact reason why they hired me for World War II. Literally just that music. They were like, this is absolutely I mean, it obviously is very different from what I did for Call of Duty, but they were telling me that sensibility and the way that the orchestra was used is exactly what they were after. So it all worked out. The really funny thing is that right after, the Star Wars First Assault, that, gets shut down. Then eventually I got Dead Island 2, and I worked on that for 2 years and developed a whole interactive system for it and wrote all the California rock music and whatnot. And then that got shut down too. But the funny thing is that was a zombie game, and then First Assault was the soldier game, and then now I get Call of Duty, which is both the soldier game and the zombie game. So it all kind of balanced out.
Yeah, you check those 2 boxes, and they went, well, he's done each of the genres, so let's do it.
Exactly.
Well, there you go. Perseverance does pay off. It's just it's tough to hear those words when you're in the moment, and when you get let go, and you're like, well, this was my paycheck for the next couple months at least, and I got to figure out what to do next. It's a bad feeling, but again, that's why you have to have that baseline and that fallback plan.
Absolutely.
Every artist has to have that.
Yeah.
Even if it means, having to be a server somewhere for a while, as long as you're making money and you're working towards that goal of what you want to do, what you want to accomplish, you can get it done.
Yeah.
Well, it's good to hear. What was the time frame between being let go at LucasArts to landing Call of Duty?
COD was I started in early 2017, and the end of LucasArts was March or April 2013.
Okay.
So about 4 years.
Wow, you had still had that music as part of your personal catalog.
Yeah.
You're like, hey, this could probably fit your genre, and then it absolutely fit what they were looking for.
Yeah,
that's cool. Even from the perspective of being the producer on the game, like, whoa, what are we thinking for music? Maybe this, maybe that, and then they hear your stuff, go, that's what we're looking for. They didn't know how to describe it until they finally heard it, and they went, that's what we're looking for.
Yeah,
it's good. It's good to have that, man, because sometimes it's tough from a producer's side when you have to be the one that makes all the decisions and what do we do for music? Well, I got to trust somebody.
And that's the fun. I don't think I've ever mentioned this on any interview, but I never had to demo for it. I never did any demo. And I actually didn't really have any reference music either for Call of Duty.
Wow.
They just said, well, try stuff. And if it's good, we'll tell you. And if it's bad, we'll definitely
tell you. Oh, they'll definitely tell you if it's bad.
Yeah.
Sometimes no notes are great. Other times no notes is not good.
Man, I was praying for reference. I was like, please just give me something. You're telling me no for everything I can possibly. But eventually we came up with something and kind of figured that.
Awesome. So episode 9's around the corner for Star Wars. Somebody who, listens to the music, I'm sure, of any type of medium, especially film. John Williams, the best composer probably of all time for film, or one of the best. What do you look forward to from your artistic composition mind when you go into a film and you listen to the score and you hear some of the older motifs or themes and how John Williams has been trying to stretch them into the new world, or a new theme like Ray's theme, which is a beautiful theme. And I thought, well, John Williams really can't compose anything else new, can he? Oh yeah, he can. He can still make some great themes. So from your sensibility, what do you look forward to when you see a film like that, and what do you kind of get out of it? What type of inspiration do you get from it?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, I got to say that once I saw Indy Crystal Skull, the Indiana Jones 4 movie or whatever, any thoughts that I may have previously had about John Williams, he can't come up with anything, that just all went out the window. So I'm not even surprised anymore when he does amazing stuff, because it's like, yeah, he's John Williams. He's written 1 billion notes by now, but he still has 1 billion more. So it's not... it wasn't a shock to, be moved by Ray's theme or by the other themes in the new films. I don't know. I mean, I actually really liked, episode 9? Was that the...
Episode 8 was the latest one, The Last Jedi.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the one that I did not like.
Well, you know what, though? I really enjoyed it. And musically, I really liked the mood throughout. It just seemed like a return to a lot of the energy that the prequels had from the soundtrack perspective. But I got to say the highlight was when it returned to that episode 4 Death Star run theme. When we heard that in the theater, I know he did it on purpose just to be like, hey, fans, I got something for you. And I jumped out of my seat cheering, I mean, there's so much great stuff in those films. And additionally, I really loved the music from Solo. It was John Powell. It wasn't John Williams doing the score for that one. But it was very different, but it expanded on Star Wars. And that's what I really loved about working on Star Wars First Assault, was that the direction was to say, like, hey, here's this, sculpture. This is Star Wars. And it's always been filmed from this angle. But what happens if we film it from that angle? And that's exactly what John Powell did. He said, all right, well, we're not talking about the mainline Jedi versus Sith story. Here's this smuggler, and like, how do we score that? And all the different worlds that he encounters. And I thought that was absolutely brilliant. I really loved that one, especially.
I am looking forward to The Mandalorian.
Yeah.
Jon Favreau show. Bill Burr's going to be in it.
Oh, yeah.
And he's famously hasn't cared about Star Wars, so I find that funny. But the song they used for the trailer is very well done. It's this melodious, it builds a little bit. There's a sense of mystery. But so much is done visually that it just punctuates what's happening visually, and it sticks with you. Like it's not necessarily thematic in terms of its melody; it's just thematic in its tone. And I'm just like, this show's going to be badass. It's got a badass tone, and I love trailer music for that reason. As somebody who's had to put together a lot of trailers in his day for Mortal Kombat and Injustice and our programs we did in the past. When I can find the right song or the right moment within that song, so much stuff happens to me visually that I get a lot of ideas, or I look at a scene and, okay, this 5 seconds is this 4 seconds is that. And I love what that does to me creatively and how much music has that inspiration. For you, what process do you go to that really kind of gets the creative juices flowing? I mean, you talked about working out and kind of thinking about or hearing the song and then writing it down, stuff like that.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that kind of adds to the inspiration? Is it playing other games? Is it going to a concert? Does it even have to involve music that you feel inspired?
Yeah, I mean, I usually like to not play video games to get inspiration for another video game score, but maybe I'll watch a film that's in a similar genre. Once again, that like 5 words ahead.
Yeah, the NDA helicopter just flew over again, folks.
So I won't say which movies I've seen, but there's a couple very amazing films in various genres that I watched and took very copious notes on, which is the worst way to watch a movie, by the way. Having to stop it every 5 seconds to write down what's happening. But,
that's what I have to do to get better at screenwriting.
Exactly, yeah.
You have to dissect it. You have to really look at the parts and how it all works.
Yeah. I wish I could go back and just watch it again just for fun, but don't really quite have the time. But nonetheless, I would do like the kind of hard research. I also try to do some transcriptions before every score. Like, for example, before Mortal Kombat, I found live taiko drum performances, and I would just transcribe exactly what their rhythms were, note for note, so that I would have more authentic rhythms when I wrote my own like taiko performances for the game. Same with Star Wars. I usually just find whenever I do a Star Wars title, like Star Wars Vader Immortal, the VR experience that I just did. Before that and before Old Republic and most of these, I just find some Star Wars cue to transcribe, just to get back into that mindset of how John Williams works. So I usually try to do some form of study, pre-composition, you could call it, before diving into a score. And like I mentioned before, I have that big list of random ideas that I just add to, and once I feel like the list is big enough, then I start to sketch. And then once I feel confident in the sketching, then I start to actually produce music. But it can be actually quite a while before I do that. One other technique that I developed working on First Assault, especially for certain kinds of games, that help. Is that, I'll load the game, and there'll be no enemies because, in First Assault's case, it was multiplayer. But I'll do what I call scoring in the first person, which is I'm actually imagining myself there and saying like, okay, what am I feeling right now? Like I'm in the game, not playing, but like I'm a physical person in this world. And, here's the characters that are next to me, and how do we feel? What do I hear? What is my emotional state? And then how does the emotional state change as I go through the level or the game or whatever? And I mean from like a second to second basis. So for example, like I don't like the concept of action loops, action music in games. I think it oftentimes kind of doesn't correspond to how you actually feel. Like if something, God forbid, but if something like went down and I don't know, like a tank shows up and blows up the house next door, you're going to be freaked out right away, right? So it's going to be like, explosion and then like big, musical blah and like action. But after a couple seconds, it would die down to more of like an intense tension. It wouldn't just be action the whole time. It would be more of like okay, the adrenaline has come down to like a reasonable level where it's actually functional. Now, how do I got to think my way through this. Where do I go? I'm not running aimlessly, but now I have a plan that I'm trying to form. And that's how I scored First Assault. There were no action loops in that. Instead, I had an actual form to each one of these little musical stingers that was generated from that emotional contour that I figured out. So it's things like that, and just kind of thinking about how does the emotional contour work for the player, and then on another level, thinking more meta about like, well, as a player, what would I want to hear? What I might want to hear isn't necessarily a precise emotional contour, but maybe I do want to hear just an action piece that's just really badass or whatever. So it's those kinds of things that sort of inspire me to not only what music I write, but also the form of the music, the way that the interactivity works, and how the music adapts to the gameplay and whatnot.
When you're mentioning First Assault, I keep thinking about Battlefield, and a lot of the sound cues that they have within the game when you either capture a spot or you're charging with your squad mates or something else happens and that music cue does hit. And there's a number of times where I'm like, yeah, let's go. You can feel it. And that is designed that way.
Absolutely.
For that to be triggered. And I have such an appreciation for that because that, again, is the deeper level of interactivity that video games can provide that film can't. That scene in that film is always going to be that score popping up, and it's perfect. It's exactly what it should do because that's exactly what that medium is. But if I approach this objective with my squad mates from the West and it's super quiet, it's stealth, action music shouldn't be playing. But if we decide to hit charge forward and we got a tank behind us, then it should swell. And how does the game know that? Well, because of all the coding that's happening, whether you're approaching from the stealth or you're approaching the action. And you have to design both the approaches. You have to design all those things. Or maybe there's 5 different approaches. Mm-hmm. I feel the technical artistry that has to go into video games is not obviously as well known compared to film because film's been around a lot longer. But I would hope within our conversation that what the audience can get out of it is the technical feats that go into it, from the sketching, the putting it all together from the ether, and then implementation. And then knowing that all those 2 to 4 years of hard work you put into 2 games is not going to see the light of day. That's...
Well, but the thing is...
you get the benefit of it.
It does, yeah. I mean, so much of what I develop on one score might make its way to another, especially in terms of the tech, because you can't really copyright tech, you know what I mean? So, so many times I've just brought something from here and put it there, and it's like, cool, let's try that. And
paste, yeah.
Yeah, and it's obviously not copying code, but just the concepts and the direction.
Sure.
And modifying it to work better in the new game, but... the fact that I've done those has been so incredibly helpful for stuff now.
It's the same for me. If I want to get back into the theater scene, the number one thing I should be doing now is learning monologues and just rehearsing my memorization and getting better at that. I'm not auditioning right now, but it's something that I could be doing every day to get better at that. And that was one of the biggest takeaways I took from an actor that I worked with back when I was getting my acting degree. Was do something every day that's going to improve you as an artist. It could be going to the gym. It could be reading. It could be memorizing a script. But as long as you do something every day, you're going to get the benefit out of it.
Yeah.
And it's true. And that would be my one recommendation to any artist is try to work on it every day, no matter what type of approach you bring. All right, man. This has been almost 2.5 hours, if you can believe it. So final 2 questions for you. The first one is... what are you looking forward to? I know the NDA helicopter's flying by again. What are you looking forward to the most, either in your creative efforts or just in media in general, before the end of the year, before 2020 is upon us? Anything happening this fall that you're really excited about?
Well, I do have to give a shout out to my next announced game, which is The Distant Light. You can just look up thedistantlight.com, or maybe I can just put it up there or something. But it is a 2.5D Metroidvania. There's a very rich story talking about the end of the Earth and 1 or 2 astronauts' mission to do something. But
so you said Metrovania. You're combining Metroid with Castlevania, correct?
Basically, yeah. So
okay.
it's all about.
I've never heard that term, but I know exactly what you mean by that term.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
It's all about it's an open world, and the parts of the world are blocked off simply by you need a certain item for traversal so that you can reach that part of the world.
Okay.
And so once you have, say, the jetpack, now you can go to this part, and then that leads you to this, and now you have this tool which lets you go to that part, and so on.
Is it 2D side-scrolling, or as you said, it's open 2D, world? So
it's 2D, but rendered in 3D.
So it's like 2.5?
2.5D.
Okay, 2.5D? That's like what Mortal Kombat 11 is, right? They consider 2.5D?
In a way, yeah. And yeah, it's probably the most unique score I've ever written because there's no dialogue, actually. And there's very little text, and all of the storytelling is done environmentally through the visuals and through, just paying really close attention to environmental details when you go into a new area.
Reminds me of Journey or Abzu.
Similar to that, yeah. And so music kind of plays a very integral role in making sure that every area is painted in a certain way. And the other interesting thing about it is that normally if you start a score and they give you reference tracks, they're going to give you, something by Hans Zimmer or like The Bourne Identity for some reason. And like, they'll give you stuff like that. But for this score, all of the reference music was 20th century art music. It was very challenging modernist music that you would see in the concert hall at a conservatory, and not necessarily, you really wouldn't expect it in a film or a video game. And so it's got this sort of art game vibe to it, where it's very challenging, sort of Debussy or John Adams or Bartók influenced music. But I then married that with very kind of 1960s style synthesizer. So it's got those two worlds kind of playing off of each other in a way that I personally haven't really heard before. So I'm very excited about that one. That is looking like an early to mid 2020 release. But that's what most of what I'll be working with towards the end of the year.
Awesome. That sounds so exhilarating, man. I'm a huge fan of the Metroid, the classic 2D Metroid, and I've been wanting Nintendo to re-release those on the Switch, and they're doing a couple, but they haven't. I don't think they've done the SNES one yet. But I think they are soon, along with Link's Awakening and a couple other Super Nintendo games, along with the official Super Nintendo controller. I'm going, okay, better save up money for that. But cool. So what was the name of the game one more time?
Anew, The Distant Light.
Anew, The Distant Light. So make sure to check that out in 2020. And then finally, where can people follow you? Where can people support you? And where can people get more updates from you?
Yeah, I post on Twitter at Wilbert Roget and also Facebook.com/RogetMusic.
Okay, Wilbert Roget, the composer for Mortal Kombat 11, Call of Duty World War II, and I'm sure many classic titles in the future. Thank you so much for joining the J.Gray Podcast, and best of luck with all your endeavors, man. We're going to be keeping an eye on all your work in the future.
Cool. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
All right. Well, that's been another great episode of the J.Gray Podcast, folks. More information about Battle for Seattle is going to be announced soon. More likely, the tournament's going to be happening at the beginning of January-ish, but I'm still working on the graphics package, and I'll get some more updates down the line. Until then, make sure to subscribe and check out the Patreon, patreon.com/Mr. Joshua Gray. Until next time, good night and good game.